Advisory Board. I wanted to start with thanks to Dr. Franny Nilsson for working with the leadership and technical staff in the departments to pull the agenda together today, which is full of updates on work in progress. Thanks also to Dylan for IT support and for anybody who's joining us online. If there's any issues or concerns, just use the chat that Dylan will be monitoring. And thanks, as always, to Paula for the logistics of parking passes and making our participation easy. In addition to the board members present today, Rich, Detlef, Viney, Betsy, Jamie, and me were joined by Elena Kenyon and Gina Kimball online. Board members Tom Starr, Dave, Howard, and John Vandenberg are absent today. Dave and John are on vacation, and Tom is under the weather. And I sent him our wishes for a speedy recovery and told him how much we appreciate his preparation and participation in almost all of our meetings. I'll remind you that the mics are live and the meeting is recorded. When you're responding to a question, speak slowly and clearly. That helps with the recording that is posted online following all of our meetings. And with that, I think I'll move to the next part of the agenda, which is the approval of the draft agenda. The draft agenda was sent by me on July 22nd. Franny sent it around again on July 29th, slightly modified. It hasn't changed since then. Are there any questions or changes about the draft agenda? And do we know of anyone who has signed up to speak during the public forum?
No one yet.
No one has. Okay, that's good because of it's good to check now because we could modify the agenda to include their comments with a particular topic at the time. Well, hearing no changes to the agenda as drafted, it would be appropriate for a motion to adopt it as offered. Thank you, Rich.
Second.
Thank you, Detlef. All in favor of approving the agenda as drafted, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Great. Well, off we go. The next thing is to review the ethics statement that I think Franny can call up on the screen for us. And I will read and then we'll pause and see if anyone has anything to declare in that regard. Okay, in accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it's the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. So with that foundation, are there any board member declarations to be made? Jamie?
I'd just like to share with everybody that I received funding to study the toxicity of PFAS. I received funding from the federal government, and I also serve as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS.
Thank you. And Detlef?
I also receive both federal and state funding to do research on PFAS, including PFMOAA, which is a topic of today's discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to pause too and see if we're able to hear or Dylan's able to monitor the chat for Elena or Gina in terms of if they have anything to declare at the ethics portion before we move along. And I guess check and make sure they're able to hear us. So Gina and Elena, are y'all able to hear?
Yes, this is Gina. I can hear.
Great, thank you.
Elena says no. Elena, I can hear fine as well.
Great. I'm glad you can hear us. Elena, I heard Gina loud and clear. You're a little bit quiet. So if you're trying to chime in and not being heard, be sure you let Dylan know. He's monitoring the chat and will let me know. Great. Well, we don't have any decision-making items before us today related to PFAS. I do think it's a very fortunate thing that the board has expertise in PFAS exposure assessment through Detlef and effects assessment through Jamie. Your expertise is really valuable. Your declarations of potential conflicts of interest are appreciated, but it shouldn't preclude your full participation in a meeting full of updates. So thanks for that. That moves us then to approval of the minutes for the April 3rd meeting. Those were sent by me also on July 22nd, with being resent July 29th by Franny, fixing one typo, but otherwise unmodified. Are there any questions, comments, changes needed on the draft minutes? Great. Well, good job drafting those, DEQ staff. Franny, is that you who does that, or you take the second cut or first cut?
That's me.
Good job. Then I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes as offered on July 29th.
So moved.
Thank you, Jamie.
Second.
Thank you, Betsy. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? Great. Well, we can take those from draft to final and ask that Paula post those on the board's website. The inclusion of the links to the talks has been a good addition for folks who've missed the meeting to be able to not just get the minutes, but also go back and see the actual presentations. We are moving right along to the agency updates portion of our agenda, and we're going to start with DHHS, and we're joined by Dr. Virginia Guidry, who's the branch head of Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Nice to be here with you all today. Zach Moore sends his regrets that he couldn't join today due to a conflict. I'd like to highlight a few things that DHHS is working on for awareness of the board. First, I wanted to mention that the Division of Public Health has a new interim director. Susan Consagra has stepped down from her position as the Division of Public Health Director and Assistant Secretary for Public Health, and Kelly Kimple is currently the interim director for our division. For some of our topical work, I wanted to highlight our climate and health work, especially as we prepare for a hurricane outside. Given that it's heat season, our heat health alert system is in full swing. We have expanded that to statewide this year, and so we are monitoring heat reports across the state and sending out alerts to anyone who's signed up for them. We have quite a number of signups across the state. A lot of those signups are with preparedness coordinators and health departments and community groups that will then further those heat alerts when they come out to their constituents. So that is in full swing. We also conduct surveillance for heat-related illness during heat season, and so that is underway as well right now. Of course, this summer we've kind of had some ups and downs on our heat, and so thankfully it hasn't been quite as brutal temperature-wise across the summer, but we are still monitoring that across the state as well. And then we are working on the climate strategy report, the DHHS climate strategy report, which is due to the governor each October, and that work has started. Regarding some environmental justice work, we continue to work to add environmental justice in community health assessments completed by local health departments across the state. So far, we have 2 that have added environmental justice as a chapter in their report, and we are working with many others. There are currently a number of health departments that are renewing their community health assessments this year, and we're doing some outreach and work in various ways to help encourage the inclusion of environmental justice there. We also continue to participate in the Governor's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I'm the co-chair of that council, and we have a number of outputs in the works. One is an EJ hub for the entire state. So it's bringing together the data from DEQ, DHHS, DOT, NCOR, other agencies all into one place. DIT is actually leading the technical side of that combination. The EJ Hub is currently drafted, and we are, in the month of August, there's a number of events and ways to provide input on the EJ Hub and guidance. Largely what will happen is the EJ Hub is drafted and DIT is already working on updates in its current form. We are collecting all of that input to be added to the next version of the EJ Hub tool. So that's very active work. And then we also have a report due to the governor on October 15th on recommended EJ activities and also recommendations for measuring cumulative impacts in our state. And so that's an important part of the environmental justice issue, basically being able to, in some way, quantify the multiple impacts that happen in some communities so that we can take that into account for decision making. The third environmental justice point that I will make is we also just finally received our funds from EPA for the Environmental Justice Government to Government Grant. I've probably mentioned that before because we were selected last fall, but we've just finally gotten the funds. So we are now launching our partnership to improve private wells in Sampson County. This is a collaboration with the Environmental Justice Community Action Network there. So a good portion of the funds will actually go to them for outreach and provision of low-cost water filters in Sampson County when wells are exceeding our guidelines. So that is just getting started. We're kind of just wrapping our head around that and getting things going. And then last, I'll just mention a wastewater surveillance update, another part of our work that overlaps with environmental health work. I'm very pleased to announce that NCDHHS was just recently selected as one of 6 centers of excellence across the country. So we will be working with CDC to help provide technical expertise and guidance to the National Wastewater Surveillance System. That center of excellence requires a partnership between the State Health Department, academic partners, and local utility. So our academic partner is UNC Chapel Hill. That's Rachel Noble's lab at UNC Chapel Hill. And then OWASA, the Orange Water and Sewer Authority in Chapel Hill, is our utility partner. So we're working on that. We continue with our wastewater surveillance program to test for COVID, of course. And if you've seen the numbers lately, you've probably heard them from your friends and family. Our COVID numbers are going up in wastewater surveillance, so definitely plenty of COVID around right now. We're also testing for flu and RSV and Mpox in the wastewater. And then there's some other external programs that also have a few sites in North Carolina, so we're monitoring their results as well for things like hepatitis A. And then very importantly, we are also enhancing our subtyping for H5N1. So we can currently detect flu A in wastewater, and when we receive detections, we send samples to UNC Chapel Hill to subtype for H5 because we're looking for that highly pathogenic avian influenza. We have had a few detections in our state in wastewater, and those get fully investigated and we try to understand more about where they're coming from. And if you've followed any of this in the news, sometimes it's from animal sources that actually are going into the wastewater. For example, milk processing that goes into the wastewater. I could say more about that, but the bottom line is that we are monitoring for H5N1 in our wastewater. We're also using our other surveillance systems to look for H5N1 and then reporting that back to CDC and working very closely with CDC on that. So we will stay tuned as H5N1 potentially unfolds. We will see. So, and with that, I think I'll end our DHHS updates, and if there's any questions, happy to answer them.
Well, thanks so much, Virginia, for the newsy update on a lot of focused good work. Are there any questions from board members on any aspect of Dr. Guidry's update? Detlef?
Yeah, thank you for the update. Could you say a little bit more about the Sampson County study? Like how many wells are you monitoring? What kinds of contaminants may be triggering that you give out filters? And also, is this through a grant, or how are these filters financed?
Yeah, so it's EPA funding, and the plan is to test private wells really for a whole suite of, contaminants, potential contaminants, including microbials and inorganic metals, as well as PFAS and other potential contaminants in Sampson County. As likely folks know here, there's various potential sources in Sampson County, and so there's really concern across different contaminants. And from the preliminary results, which are not from us, but from partners at UNC Chapel Hill and App State, there's really kind of a mix that is measured there. I mean, sometimes it's microbial issues, sometimes it's PFAS measured, sometimes it's metals. And so it's really the whole range of potential contaminants that we're measuring. I think, I can't remember exactly the number of wells we're hoping to test, but it is in the hundreds. And part of it is, testing the wells, providing the outreach and health education on, responsibility for wells, taking care of wells, the treatment if needed. I mentioned the pitcher filters, which we have selected and will be purchasing with those funds to help provide low-cost treatment and treatment that's easy to maintain. Largely, those will be distributed by the Environmental Justice Community Action Network. Basically answer your question? Yeah. So just getting started on that, although there are other projects happening in Sampson County, and so UNC, Chapel Hill, and App State are already doing some testing there, and we're kind of building on that, to do further testing and just try to provide more options for the folks in Sampson County there. And our hope is that Sampson County will be the starting point, and, we'll see how it goes, and then maybe we can, get additional funding and expand from there. Because as we all know, private well testing and treatment continues to be a huge need in our state. And so trying, at least in one county, to try to tackle that to some extent with partners there and, explore options for additional work in the future.
Other questions or comments?
I just wanted to quickly say congratulations on the Centers for Excellence Award. That's fantastic.
It's a lot of work, but we've done a lot of work with our wastewater surveillance program, so it was pretty exciting to be selected. So, all right,
Thank you. We appreciate it. For the DEQ update, we're joined by Assistant Secretary for the Environment, Sushma Masemore. Good morning.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I felt like I wanted to just reach out to you all and just thank you for your time and your volunteering to support us and DHHS throughout this year. We know you have very busy schedules and high priorities, but you do continue to come to these meetings and review a lot of documents and give us sound advice and, make some informed decisions on our behalf. So we really appreciate that. And I wanted to just extend that appreciation. I'm going to talk about 4 items, and feel free to just ask questions at the end of that or in the middle of that. And if I miss something that you want to hear about from DEQ, I'm happy to interject that. So I'll cover PFAS standards and PFAS regulatory work within the department. I'll cover PFAS monitoring, the kind of activities that are going on across the state. I'll cover a little bit on 1,4-dioxane, which is something you all started discussing in the last couple of meetings. And then I'll just highlight a variety of things going on in the climate change, mitigation, and resiliency arena. So I'll start out with the PFAS standards. As you know, in April, EPA set the regulatory standards, what we call maximum contamination level for drinking water standards for 6 PFAS chemicals. It basically set the stage for regulating the amount of PFAS that can be allowed in public water systems. We presented quite a bit of that in the past with you all, with what the proposed amounts were and how it would impact North Carolinians. We presented to the Environmental Management Commission back in May. So there's a lot of material out there, but we wanted to give you all a high-level takeaway of that regulatory action because it's very important and it does set the stage for other PFAS work. And Rebecca Sadowski here will be talking about that later this morning, and it's an important topic. And so that drinking water standards sets in motion, at least from the state's perspective, in order to ensure those drinking water supplies are protected. We at the state level have the authority to implement what we call surface water standards under the Clean Water Act. Surface water standards basically allows the discharges of wastewater to be at particular levels that are deemed safe or according to our standards, what they should be. And so, as you know, and we've been talking about this for some time now, that in order to establish those surface water standards, we need the science. We need the data, such as the reference dose or Kansas load factor, bioaccumulation factors, and so on, in order to compute what those surface water targets would be for those dischargers. So for almost a year and a half now, we've been working towards building that foundation. And in earlier part of this year, I believe it's May, although we have been presenting information items to the Environmental Management Commission's Water Quality Committee on that for some time. And we presented the proposed standards for 8 PFAS. Those PFAS have been completed in terms of their risk assessment analysis by EPA or various other agencies, and we put all that together and presented what those standards would be. And we evaluated what the regulatory impact analysis or financial impact would be to the sources that are discharging. All of that information was presented to the Water Quality Committee of the EMC. And the RIA and all of that information is on our website. But the key takeaway is that it does provide a quantitative and a qualitative estimate of what the cost of the regulation would be to the regulated community. But it also quantifies the human health benefits and societal benefits and environmental benefits for those standards. And it is a robust analysis that looks at private wells as well as drinking water systems and other parts of our economy that would benefit from such standards. That RIA, Regulatory Impact Analysis, was approved, certified by Office of State Budget and Management, which is a necessary step before standards can move forward. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that that entire rulemaking package that we've been working on for almost 2 years with you all has been in front of the committee for consideration. And in the July meeting, they had a variety of questions, some written and some verbal, that we're going through right now at the department level and the division levels together to respond, and so that we could address the concerns that the committee members are having. The next step would be, and Chris Ventalora will talk about this particular rulemaking and the next step, what the next steps are and what the timeline looks like. It's a long journey to establishing standards. Another standards development work that I wanted to highlight was very similar, is groundwater standards. The groundwater standards are used by the state in a variety of programs. Often they're used to require cleanups when contamination from a site or unknown or known sites have contaminated water supply or drinking water supplies, whether it's private wells or other systems, and that they must be cleaned up because foreign or contamination has been detected. We use the same scientific data to establish groundwater standards for those 8 PFAS compounds and presented that to the Groundwater Committee of the EMC. And in July of that meeting, they voted to proceed with 3 of those 8, and we're working to modify the regulatory impact analysis and bring back to the committee the subset of those 8 that was originally proposed by the department that the committee is interested in pursuing and moving forward with rulemaking. And Bridget Shelton is going to talk about at a high level what that process took and what the numbers are. But I wanted to reach out to you all for the work that you did on helping us do the comparative analysis on the bioaccumulation factor. You may recall that about a year ago, we asked you the bioaccumulation factors that we derived at the state level using our own data versus the various EPA and international studies, what the relative comparisons between them mean for these compounds. That has formed a good foundation for the support of the BAFs that we ended up using in our rulemaking. And another area you all helped us was the toxicity assessment of the different 8 PFAS that was done by different EPA offices. You may recall that normally the RS assessment is done, and we normally use that. But this time for PFAS, EPA has used a variety of programs to do this vast amount of PFAS human health assessment work. And that comparative work that you just wrapped up has also been used in our rulemaking to provide that additional justification on the merits of the data. And so I wanted to let you know that that work has been very valuable, and we've integrated that into our packages. So I'm going to pause there, see if there are any questions on the standards before I move to monitoring. Yes, sir.
Ms. Devine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mesmo. My question is actually twofold. Since in North Carolina, we have determined the major sources of PFAS, what are some other concerns that the division or the department has in terms of PFAS being emitted into or discharged into water or air?
Well, it's an evolving science, and it's an evolving regulatory program. I would say that our understanding of the sources of PFAS is growing. The process we follow to identify potential PFAS dischargers, these are water systems dischargers, are based on an analysis and an accumulation of all the industry types that are known to be users, manufacturers, formulators, and or have some connection with potential discharges in water systems. And so we've done a fairly comprehensive analysis of the SIC codes and NAICS and the industry types that have the potential to use chemicals that may have PFAS in raw materials and or have the potential to create that in their processing or processes in their operations. And we've used that to then crosswalk with the type of industries and activities that are in the state. And that's how we've done our regulatory impact analysis is of all the permitted sites, how many or what fraction of them would have the potential to have PFAS discharges. Similarly, our Division of Air Quality has been also looking at PFAS that may be emitted from air stacks or fugitive emissions. And that itself, there's no EPA and or state regulatory work going on other than acknowledgement that inherently that emissions of PFAS can occur depending on the type of activity that manufacturing site or other activities may release that. So when we are experiences with Comores site and a couple others that we're familiar with. So to give you sort of like a little bit of a closure on that, one of the things we're doing is using that inventory of potential PFAS source types that are linked. Every time we touch a permit or a new permit comes into our doorway, we ask these screening questions to better understand their potential for PFAS releases.
So is it fair to say that you rely on the industry to tell you what kind of PFAS might be present? Or is it that you yourself go out and figure out that there is a problem?
It's both.
Both.
Yeah. I would say at this point, we have relied more on our own monitoring and our own analysis to be more educated and versed in where to look. But I think it is an evolving area, and we will continue to find sources, and we may continue to find sources we thought that may have potential, may not. We are finding sites that are using alternatives already and changing their operations using BMPs to address this on a voluntary basis.
And one last question before. In terms of the threshold of PFAS, and there are so many of them, is the state by and large meeting the standards, or there are areas of concern that you'd like to share with us?
I think these proposed standards actually get to those areas of concern. We do, if you look at, and maybe Rebecca will cover that, if you look at the levels of PFAS in our drinking water systems, the concentration that is coming out at the tap, what people are drinking, those data are collected under the EPA's UCMR program. And we have North Carolina's data for every public water system. And then you can compare that with other public water systems in our surrounding states and across the country. And if you look at our systems, the number of systems that are our North Carolina systems that are above the MCLs are on average larger number of systems than the rest of the country. It could be because we have more systems, we're a populous state, we're a growing state, we're very industrial, and we have a lot of people. But if you look at also the range of PFAS concentration seen within those systems, we are slightly above average. And when we look at contaminants like 1,4-dioxane, we really stand out compared to national data. And there are places within the state that are more prevalent, such as the Cape Fear River Basin, and a couple other what we call, high population, high industrial corridor areas. And so we've had the privilege or the ability to look at this data to be able to tell, is it, like you said, is it a concern? And our assessment is yes. And for that reason, we are asking the EMC to consider the standards process as one of the authorities that we have, but as a state has an obligation in the Clean Water Act to take.
Thank you so very much.
Sure.
I'll remind, one more question, but I'll remind us that the next topic on the agenda is a deeper dive into the PFAS standards rulemaking.
Maybe a higher level question. So thank you for the update. I'm curious, with the water quality standard for surface water, the Clean Water Act has kind of a narrative in there that says that upstream dischargers shouldn't degrade water quality to the point where a downstream drinking water utility has to add advanced treatment to meet the standard for that particular chemical. Is that part of your analysis, or is it solely based on toxicity and bioaccumulation and things like that?
It is absolutely a part of our analysis. In fact, it is the foundation upon which we're saying that the drinking water system's requirements to meet the MCLs, in some cases, perhaps in many cases, are contingent on how polluted the incoming water is. If that water is influenced by other dischargers upstream of them, then cleaning up those upstream dischargers would benefit those utilities that are drinking water systems and ultimately their ratepayers. And so one of the things we're trying to do is complement the various federal programs to ensure that the regulatory requirement and the impact and potentially all the costs are spread out. And so one entity or one group of residents are not paying the burden of all of the contaminants that may be coming from upstream dischargers. And it gets a little tricky, some of those dischargers, about 53 of them are under DEQ's purview. We directly issue NPDES permits for those direct dischargers. However, there's almost 400 or so that are under the purview of a POTW, or wastewater treatment plant, that are at the municipal level. And those significant industrial users, we call SIUs, are also part of our rulemaking to say that we can't do this alone. We can't just look at the direct dischargers. It has to be all of the dischargers under both programs, those that are under the state purview and those that are under the POTW's purview. And that's really where a lot of the communication and clarity is being defined as to what that impact could be to those sources.
Great. Well, let's let you move along to issue 204, PFAS monitoring.
Yeah, at the high level, I'll just say, we've talked a little bit about Chemours site PFAS monitoring. And this is all the private wells that are being monitored, tested under the consent order. We are continuing to work through the consent order. At some places, we're over 20 miles out. One of the things we're doing more recently, and we should be able to share more broadly in a few weeks or a few months, is we're trying to look at how far out do we need to go based on the data that we're seeing. And our team between the Division of Waste Management and Water Resources and our Secretary's office is looking at that data to potentially identify that further extent of the contamination. And it may say that we may have to go far out to beyond that where we are so that we can do infill in a faster pace and so that we can provide relief to the homeowners in a vast area compared to the step out that we're doing. It is a new strategy, and I think we have a good foundation for supporting that, and we're working with Chemours in putting that into a process. Another thing I'll say is that the Lower Cape Fear, those 4 counties we often talked about, these were added after the consent order to say the contamination has gone further out to the Lower Cape Fear. There's a variety of work going on. And every couple of weeks, we get a report on how many additional homeowners have been provided alternate water. And I believe we're at about 1,500 additional sites that are getting filtration under the consent order, and about 9,000 or so near the facility. When I say near the facilities, within that 25 mile radius. So, and that's just the high level update on Chemours. We have a lot more going on there. Another high-level update I wanted to let you know is that more recently, our department was conducting testing at drinking water systems as part of the MCL's work that Rebecca will talk about. And in that process, we determined that an industrial site had high levels of PFAS above the MCLs. And then we looked at adjoining receptors and locations. And as a result, we found there's an elementary school that was located. This is in Randolph County. And Farmer Elementary had elevated levels of PFAS that required immediate attention. And so our department has been working with the superintendent and the county officials. And currently, there's a plan to replace the point of use and potentially point of entry systems with filtration. And that work is going on currently as we speak. And more information is available on our website, and we can provide that later. But just want to let you know that is, as we collect and understand more, we're finding sites that require immediate attention. Another thing I'll highlight is that Michael Scott's team has been, since July of last year, has been collecting landfill data through all the sites that are permitted under the landfill program. Those sites are reporting their PFAS levels in their groundwater and their leachate and so on. Those data are coming in, and in the coming soon we will be releasing that and posting that information so the public can access it, because we've had a lot of requests for that. But we're also using that to prioritize and work with the sites to take the next steps. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about 1,4-dioxane. That's something that you all worked on. We wrapped up a human health assessment study report. Some of you were involved in that legislative report. We're very happy with how it turned out. It was a lot of work, and it was a quick process. There were 3 other studies that were authorized, and only one of them was submitted formally to the legislature. And Franny's going to talk a little bit about that study and how it's formed the basis of our rulemaking related to 1,4-dioxane, and it's further supported some of our thinking. So I'm going to just stop there on PFAS and just at a high level, just tell you that on the climate change arena, We have a lot of various mitigation-related work going on and greenhouse gas emission reductions across our Division of Air Quality, across our State Energy Office, and a couple other programs. And one of the things we try to look at is where the larger sources of emissions, transportation, power sector, homes and buildings. And just yesterday, Secretary Granholm was here announcing an award to the State Energy Office that looks at the power grid and putting climate resiliency into the systems that allow faster, easier transfer of electricity during power outages. We're also looking at homes rebate programs through DOE grants and their BIL. It's going to be a very large, massive program that's going to increase energy efficiency in qualified homes. And then finally, a lot going on in transportation emission reductions. And then one last thing I'll say on the climate arena is under the climate protection program that EPA established about a year ago, they just announced a few awards. North Carolina was a recipient of one of 4 states' joint award that looked at climate resilience and carbon sequestration through natural and working lands. And this is basically something that we have at the department have championed for almost 4 or 5 years. Almost a quarter of our anthropogenic emissions are offset by carbon sequestration within our trees and our forest land. And this hundreds of millions of dollars worth of EPA grant will help us further that cause, protect our wetlands and our forest resources through, managed approach. So just want to share that with you all. Sorry it took a little while.
No, that's fine. A lot of good things going on, and congratulations on the big EPA award. I think it was something like $247 million to be split between 4 states.
Yes,
A lot of
and
money.
our Department of Natural and Cultural Resources would be the lead agency on that, and our partners are part of the recipients.
Thanks so much. Before you leave, any questions on the last part of the update from DEQ? Bonnie?
If I could, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mesmo. You highlighted the major greenhouse gas emitters, transportation being one of them. But I'm somewhat surprised and puzzled that you did not identify agriculture as a source of greenhouse emissions. Is there something?
Yeah, I would just say there's a statewide greenhouse gas inventory that the Division of Air Quality, and Mike Ebrzinskis is here if you have further questions. That inventory was updated and released earlier this year, and it does include emissions from the agricultural operations.
So that's both methane and nitrous oxide?
Yes, sir.
Am I right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it includes all economic sectors.
So before I let you go, is agriculture a major source for greenhouse gas based on this inventory, or should I be reading this inventory?
Don't quote me on this, but it is probably between 6 to 8% of our total gross emissions.
8.9.
Within the margin for error.
Yes. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Dr. Mesmo.
Before you leave, let me just pause too and say for Elena and Gina on the phone, any questions for Secretary Macemore, Assistant Secretary Macemore? All right. Well, we move on to a couple of informational updates, which will be a deeper dive into the topics that we just heard of. If we're taking them in order, the next one would be an update on the PFAS water quality standards rulemaking, the first topic that Sushma covered for us. And I see Franny at the podium, so are you the one who's going to kick that one off?
Oh, no, I'm just opening the PowerPoint.
And we heard Chris Ventiloro maybe doing a portion of that.
Yes.
And Rebecca may be doing a portion of that.
Hey, Dylan, you come here. I need to. Yeah. Here. Okay. So just sign that again.
Thanks.
All right. Good morning. I'm Rebecca Sadowski with the Public Water Supply Section, and I'm going to be giving a brief overview of the federal PFAS rule and what North Carolina is doing in advance of that rule to help our water systems prepare. So we have a lot of water systems that are covered by the PFAS rule. I'll talk about a little bit about the timeline, some of the key effective dates, and a little bit, just one slide on our overview of what we're doing as far as sampling goes. So all North Carolina community water systems and our non-transient, non-community water systems with their own source will be required to sample under this rule. And community water systems are places where people live, our cities and our towns, our municipal systems. And then non-transient, non-community water systems, you can think of those as they're typically businesses that have their own source of water. So it's a place, or schools, we've got actually a lot of schools in the central part of the state that have their own sources of drinking water. And so it's a place where people go on a regular basis and get a large portion of their drinking water at that source. So the total number of systems that are going to be affected by this rule is just under 2,000. The majority of them are going to be community water systems, and we have a larger number of groundwater systems in the state than surface water systems. So as you all probably know, the final rule MCLs and have also a hazard index. So PFOA and PFOS, the MCL is 4.0. For PFHXS, it's 10 parts per trillion. And 8 for Gen X and PFNA, it's also at 10 parts per trillion. And then there's a hazard index for a combination of 4 contaminants, sorry. And so here's a list of the hazard index. It's a long established approach that the EPA regularly uses, for example, in the Superfund program. It determines the health concerns associated with exposures to chemical mixtures. It's calculated by adding the ratio of the water sample concentration to a health-based water concentration. And if the result is greater than one of the combination of those ratios, then the system would have an MCL and need to take action to reduce those concentrations. And to be considered a hazard index MCL, it has to be a mixture of 2. If you have just one contaminant, then it would not be considered an exceedance of that hazard index, but it would still be an MCL violation. MCLs are going to be calculated on a running annual average basis. So you'll take 4 quarterly samples and it's running. So it could be like the 3rd quarter, the 4th quarter, the 1st and the 2nd, and we'll calculate those every quarter to determine the MCL, and we'll just determine that every quarter. And so a lot of times if water systems have a really large concentration, they may go back under the MCLs with their quarterly results, but they'll still have an MCL violation because that one larger concentration is still driving their MCL number above. So for the PFAS rule implementation, the water systems are going to have to conduct initial and ongoing compliance monitoring for the 6 regulated PFAS compounds. I'll be going into that initial monitoring because that's what the water systems are doing right now. They'll have to implement solutions to reduce the regulated PFAS if they do have results over the MCL. They'll have to inform the public of those levels of the regulated PFAS measured in their drinking water, both every time they monitor, as well as if they have a result over an MCL, they'll have to do a different kind of public notification for that, more immediate than just the annual notification that they would do for all of their regulated contaminants that they have detections of. They'll have to take samples at all of their entry points to the distribution system. So if a water system has multiple wells, they may have multiple treatment plants, so they may have to take more than one PFAS sample. I will say that the majority of our water systems are small systems with only one well and only one entry point, but a lot of our larger systems have multiple entry points. And they'll have to sample at each entry point to the distribution system during normal representative operating conditions. And that's typical of our other drinking water rules. So our initial sampling requirements, water systems are going to have to monitor either quarterly or biannually before April 26, 2027. And they'll have to conduct that initial monitoring at each of their entry points to determine their compliance monitoring schedules. So all groundwater systems that are greater than 10,000 and all of our surface water systems are going to have to monitor for quarterly, and they'll have to take 4 consecutive samples 2 to 4 months apart within a 12-month period. And then the biannual samples are going to be the majority of our systems, water systems, community and non-transient, non-community, serving less than 10,000 people. They'll have to take 2 samples 5 to 7 months apart within a 12-month period. I will say this, that EPA has given us a little bit of flexibility in that if a water system collected a sample, say this year, but then they can come and they didn't take the rest of their 4 quarterly samples this year, they can come back and fill in the missing quarters next year or the year after. So they are allowing a little bit of flexibility in this initial monitoring. This is something that EPA really hasn't done a whole lot before. Usually water systems are just placed on a schedule at the beginning of compliance. This initial monitoring is something that's relatively new. And that EPA hasn't provided all of the guidance. So water systems are asking us questions and we don't have all of the answers at this point in time. For example, we have some of our water systems that are saying, you know, we've collected a bunch of samples, but we haven't collected field blanks. Are you going to be able to accept those samples? And I don't know the answer to that question yet. So we're still seeking some answers from EPA. And so those results are going to be evaluated based on against a trigger level, which is typically half of the MCLs. And if all of the results are less than those trigger levels, then the water systems can go on reduced monitoring. Otherwise, if they have any sample in any quarter for any of their results, then they will have to go on their standard monitoring, which is typically going to be quarterly for these water systems. And that will be at each entry point. So each entry point to the distribution system can have a different schedule for water systems. And this initial monitoring is going to be, we have 3,400 entry points approximately that water systems are going to have to monitor for this initial monitoring. And EPA hasn't provided us with a database or anywhere to put all of this data. So we have to accept all of this data and evaluate it. And I think it'll be on my next slide. So water systems have to do this by April 26, 2027, and then that same day, we are required to have their monitoring schedules ready because they have to start their compliance monitoring. So this is posing, you know, something that we're trying to figure out how we're gonna handle moving forward. A lot of that data, as Sushma mentioned, is coming in via the UCMR5, and so, but that only covers about 300 of our water systems, and we have 2,000 water systems. So there's still a large portion of data that we're going to have to get from the water systems. And we've been conducting a lot of that sampling to help the water systems. And we're hopefully going to continue with assisting with some of that initial monitoring. Again, just some of the effective dates. So the water systems, we have compliance with the analytical requirements back in June 25th of 2024. And then the water systems have to, as I mentioned, report the results of those initial monitoring samples on April 26, 2027. They'll also have to start meeting the compliance monitoring requirements on April 26, 2027. Then they'll have to put that data in those consumer confidence reports, as I was mentioned, and start doing those public notifications of any results that are greater than the MCL. And they will then have to meet the MCL, comply with those MCLs in April 26 of 2029. So they'll have an additional 2 years after they start monitoring to comply with the MCLs. And then just here is some of the data that we've been collecting and that others have been collecting in advance of this rule to try and get a handle on what's going on in our drinking water here in North Carolina. So obviously the collaboratory took some samples, a couple of years ago. So we had that data to base our some initial monitoring on back in 2022. We took samples at 50 water systems. We took both raw and finished water just to get an idea. Again, we're just learning. The science is improving as we're moving along. And then we collected additional samples at 534 water systems last year, and those are mostly small schools, daycares, mobile home parks. And then we finished that up. So we have essentially offered sampling to every water system in the state of North Carolina. It's voluntary sampling. Water systems can turn us down, and some have, but a lot of them have taken us up on this offer to sample so that they have an idea of what's going on in their water system. And we sample at one entry point to the distribution system. So we're not doing all of the monitoring, but it's giving them an idea. And if a water system has a result greater than an MCL, we are going back and sampling the rest of their entry points so that they have an idea if they have 5 entry points, that this one has PFAS and the rest don't, so that helps give them some operational information moving forward. And then, as I mentioned, 300 systems are monitoring under UCMR 5. We have data for 192 systems so far. So again, that sampling is ongoing. And then Aqua North Carolina is collecting their own samples. That's a utility here in North Carolina that operates approximately 700 water systems. So that's a large chunk of our water systems. And they have been very proactive in their sampling. They have a plan to come into compliance well before the 2029 compliance date. They have actually already submitted plans and specifications for treatment options for over 50 water systems that our group has approved. And so they are in the process of installing that treatment as we speak. And so they have a phased approach. They have, I believe, approximately 200 water systems that they're planning to install treatment to comply with the MCL. So that's a large undertaking. So they're kind of doing a phased approach to that. But again, in an attempt to be in compliance well before the 2029 compliance deadline. And then Carolina Water is another one of our larger utilities that operates approximately 100 water systems in the state. And we have some more limited data from them. And so we're still in talks with them about what their plans are to come into compliance. So we are all of the samples that we have collected, we are sending out notifications, letters with those results in them, letting the water systems know if they are above an MCL or below the MCL. And again, it's just one sample, so it's not an official, you're out of compliance with the MCL, because that's a running annual average, but it is good data for them to have so that they can start moving towards and identifying whether or not they need to install treatment to reduce the concentrations, or maybe drill another well, or attach to, a lot of these small rural water systems may attach to a larger municipal system that's nearby. And there is funding available, and we're letting them know that as well in our letters with our partnership with our Division of Water Infrastructure. So that's some of the more proactive things that we're doing. I'm hoping that we may be able to provide even more additional assistance to take even more samples for that initial monitoring to help the water systems. So as of June 18th in 2024, we had approximately 340 water systems. 18% of the water systems that are going to have to comply had at least one result greater than an MCL or the hazard index. PFOA and PFOS are the most prominent of the contaminants that we are seeing above the MCL. We are seeing a few exceedances of the hazard index, and we're seeing detections of PFAS other than the 6 compounds in the proposed regulation. So, and that's something that questions, again, that we're still having, and that we don't know if so we have a federal database that once compliance comes into effect, the EPA, they maintain this database, and we're still unsure of whether or not EPA is going to require us to collect only those 6 contaminants that are regulated under the rule, or are they going to have space in this database for us to collect all of the data, because water systems can use method either 533 or 537.1, which overlap but don't overlap fully. So what is that going to look like in our database, and just having that data available? So we're looking at some IT solutions as well on what are we going to do and how are we going to collect that data for further use. And I think that's everything for me. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, thanks so much. That's fascinating to see the environmental science that the complexities don't end there. The rulemaking has complexity, and then all of this work for rule implementation. It's also very interesting to see that the process has already led to some risk reduction with people voluntarily getting out in front of it.
Yes.
So thanks so much for the newsy presentation. Questions for Rebecca? Detlef?
Just a quick one. Well,
Sure.
but first, it's really great to see how much progress there's been in monitoring so many systems. Of the almost 2,000, for how many do you have data so far, and what's the plan for the ones that have not been tested yet?
So I'm going to guesstimate it's approximately 1,600 to 1,700 water systems that will have some piece of data for. So far, there's data coming in from all different places, which, as I'm sure all of you know, is very difficult to deal with. We don't have one database, which would be great, one database with all of this data in it. We have federal database with the UCMR data, and then we have one database that we have, and then, Carolina Water, which Aqua North Carolina has a lot of data, but they gave it to us in a completely different format and not all of the information. So I don't have accurate numbers on exactly how many water systems, but I'm going to guess that it's about 1,600. Again, those water systems don't have to monitor yet. They still have some time, and so we will be reaching out to them again and encouraging them to monitor the ones that we don't have data for. But there probably will be a little bit of a gap moving forward until they're absolutely required to do it.
And you had like 500 plus, I think, in 2023, and another, I forget, 300 some in 2024. Can we add those two numbers, or are you?
For the most part, yes. We did resample one or two of those water systems, for various reasons. But yes, those two numbers we can mostly add up. So, so that's over about 800 water systems, then the Aqua data, so that's 1,500 water systems, and then,
Yeah.
so, we're getting there.
Getting there. That's
Yep.
great. And I think you mentioned it, but just for clarification, do the UCMR5 data count towards this monitoring requirement?
It does. It does. One of the hurdles that I don't know the EPA anticipated, everything that is below the reporting level, which is 4 for PFOS and PFOA, for example, they're just reporting as non-detect. But in order to qualify for reduced monitoring, you have to evaluate the data versus a 2.0, which is half of the MCL, and I don't have that data. So EPA has gone back and they're going to try to come up with a resolution for that, is what I've been told. But as of right now, I don't have any more data other than the non-detect. And I can't count that as a 0.
So this is an interesting analytical chemistry detail, but
Yes.
like labs like Eurofins, they can report to levels lower than 4, and internally they have this data. Are they sharing this information with the utilities, or are they just reporting less than 4 as less than the MRL?
So for the larger water systems, they're collecting their own data under UCMR5 and then mailing the samples to EPA. And so they're essentially contracting and they're paying for that data. So I would anticipate, I don't get a copy of it, but I would anticipate that those water systems are getting those results that are less than the reporting level. However, the smaller water systems that EPA is paying for their sampling, which is a much smaller percentage, but they wouldn't necessarily get that data because I'm not sure what EPA's contract with their labs is like. And again, I don't have it. I just have access to what everybody else has access to, the federal database.
Jamie?
This is probably a premature question, and it speaks a little bit to maybe my lack of understanding about how the rule will be implemented for remediation or filtration technologies. But will any of these data guide decisions for what remediation technologies or filtration technologies will be put into place? For example, if a if a system only has detects for PFOA and PFOS, will they use a different technology than a system that has detects for the other 4 PFAS? Or does that not matter at all?
It definitely could. That's not something that we wouldn't dictate what type of treatment technologies the water systems would utilize. They would go to a consultant, typically an engineering consulting firm, and then that engineering consulting firm would run some pilot testing to let them know whether, a certain type of ion exchange resin would be better than a different type of ion exchange resin versus a GAC solution, something like that. So that is something that would be handled outside, but most definitely they are targeting different types of contaminants with different resins and treatment technologies. And I will say that one of the things that the water systems are having difficulty with now is that if they already have iron and manganese or arsenic or some other types of contamination, that definitely plays in a role in what type of resin or treatment technology they're going to be using. So it gets somewhat complicated because if you're removing one contaminant and that's really binding up your resin, and then your PFAS is going to come through and break through even sooner because it's already being bound with these other contaminants. So just something that the water systems are going to have to deal with. And one thing that I didn't mention, sorry about that, is that rule adoption. So we have to adopt this. We are planning to adopt this rule by reference, and we have a fiscal analysis that we're in the process of reviewing internally. Moving forward with that, we are planning to adopt the rule by reference and not make any changes. So everything that you see on EPA's website is what we are planning to adopt here.
Yeah, that sounds real consistent with the PFAS strategy the department outlined to take advantage of federal actions for those pollutants when available and focus in on the things that might be more unique issues in North Carolina so that those aren't ignored, but avoiding duplication of effort for what's a big class of compounds and a lot of work to do.
Right.
Before you leave, let me see if Gina on the phone or the web access or Elena have any questions, and if not, we'll move along.
This is Gina. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Great, glad you can hear. And Elena? Okay.
And then she's trying to troubleshoot and we'll reestablish.
Well, I'm glad you're on that, Dylan, with her. Thanks. Rich?
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you. So I'm just curious, maybe you said this, but are the data by outfits such as Aqua publicly available?
So they're not required to make it publicly available at this point in time. Once they start collecting compliance data, it will be. I will say that Aqua has their data in a limited format on their website, and they are providing that to their customers in their consumer confidence reports, again, in that more limited format. So it is somewhat available.
Yeah, I have a vested interest in that.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, was there anything else on this topic? Any other people presenting for DEQ on this topic? Then Franny, how long is your 1,4-dioxane update?
It's quick.
Then let's take a break until 11:30 and then do it then. Is that okay?
There's 2 more pieces to the rulemaking presentation.
Okay, I was asking that question. I didn't get an
Okay.
answer. So let's do that then. We'll do that rulemaking and then take a break. So I see we're going to be joined by Chris Ventiloro, who's the state's Water Quality Standards Coordinator. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Chris Ventiloro, Water Quality Standards Coordinator, Division of Water Resources. It's been some time since I've been before you, so I hope everyone's doing well, and I hope y'all can manage to stay dry during the storm. But this morning, I'm going to provide a quick overview of the rulemaking efforts for the adoption of the PFAS standards and the O2B surface water standards, as well as the implementation plan. Okay. So as a quick reminder, it's been some time since we've discussed surface water standards, I think, but the adoption of surface water standards is required to proceed through a rulemaking process to meet the requirements of both the North Carolina Administrative Code and the Clean Water Act. So the general steps in the process are shown here, but they include the development of a rulemaking package, state approval of any amendments to those rules, followed then by federal approval by the EPA of any amendments to those rules. In addition, there's an additional requirement from General Statute 150B that a regulatory impact analysis be completed. And this is done to determine if a rulemaking will affect state funds, local governments, or result in substantial economic impact. And this RIA, or regulatory impact analysis, must be approved by the Office of State Budget and Management, or otherwise referred to as OSBM. For PFAS, DEQ has developed surface water standards for 8 PFAS compounds shown here, and is proposing to adopt the numeric standards for these PFAS compounds, as well as rule language concerning how these standards will be implemented in the NPDES permits. And you can see the stars here indicate which of these compounds are currently regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act in the form of either MCLs or hazard index. So you are probably aware that the standards were derived for these 8 specific PFAS compounds because the health effects information was available and was published in peer-reviewed scientific studies that had been evaluated by federal agencies and other scientific experts. The data supported development of reference doses and/or cancer slope factors. All of these compounds have been detected in North Carolina's environmental media, and all of the compounds can be accurately measured by EPA test method 1633. In addition to that, as Assistant Secretary Basemore mentioned, the Secretary of Science Advisory Board, this board provided critical scientific support for the development of these OTB standards. And part of that was evaluating the EPA and DEQ bioaccumulation factor data, determining that the data was similar and scientifically sound to be used for developing surface water criteria, and also through evaluating the PFAS toxicity assessments provided by EPA and CDC and determining that they are of equivalent scientific quality to the IRIS toxicity assessment program. This table shows the actual numeric standards that are being proposed for adoption in the O2B rules. You can see the water supply protection standards, which apply to all waters that are classified as public water supplies, in the second column, as well as the non-water supply standards, which mainly protect for the consumption of fish tissue in the middle column there. In the past, we've presented on the equations that were used to derive these criteria. And so I didn't include that information here again, just in the interest of saving time. But in short, EPA's 2000 guidance for deriving ambient criteria for the protection of human health were used, as well as EPA's current exposure factors for body weight, fish consumption rate, and water intake rate. So EPA last updated those values in 2015, and they are a bit more current than the values that we currently have established in our rules. So those exposure factors were used in the derivation of these criteria values. The table also indicates how the standards will be implemented as permit effluent limits, and I'll touch more on that in a second. But in general, the proposed health standards for PFAS, PFOA, and PFAS will be calculated so the standards will be calculated, or the effluent limits will be calculated based on site-specific conditions. And if PFOA and PFOS effluent limits are calculated at being less than 4 nanograms per liter, the effluent limits will be set to 4 nanograms per liter based on the PQL published by EPA in their drinking water MCL documents. In a basic sense, following adoption of the PFAS standards into the O2B rules, permitted facilities will be required to conduct 2 years of assessment monitoring using EPA's 1633 final method. And then following that, they will be required to conduct a further 2 years of assessment monitoring once method 1633 has been promulgated in Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations in Part 136. And this is an important distinction because before that data can be used to establish effluent limits, it has to be adopted into 40 CFR. So following the adoption of that method into 40 CFR 136 and the 2 years of certified monitoring, facilities will receive effluent limits based on the facility-specific measured concentrations of PFAS compounds. This slide provides a different way of kind of looking at that timeline. And again, you can see that, the assessment monitoring will begin as soon as the standards are adopted, followed by that certified monitoring once this method 1633 is promulgated in 40 CFR. And then after that, during that period of time, industries will start to see the development of effluent limits. Now, DEQ has presented information on surface water PFAS rulemaking to the Water Quality Committee and the Environmental Management Commission, beginning back in November of 2023. These early presentations were mostly about informing the EMC and Water Quality Committee members of the specific need for PFAS standards in North Carolina, and then also providing them the background on the scientific information that was going to be used to develop the numeric criteria for the surface water standards. And then these presentations ultimately culminated with going to the Water Quality Committee in July of 2024, which to request approval to basically begin the rulemaking process to adopt the PFAS standards in the O2B rules. Now, the action proposed to the Water Quality Committee during this July meeting was to request to proceed to the full Environmental Management Commission so that the commission could approve the proposed rule amendments and the regulatory impact analysis to go out for public notice and hearing, as is required again by the North Carolina Administrative Procedures Act and the Clean Water Act. And the result of this request was that the Water Quality Committee declined to approve the rulemaking to proceed to the next step of the process due to a number of questions that they had regarding the regulatory impact analysis as well as the development of the standards. So the next step for the department is to respond to those questions that the committee members had, and then to return to the Water Quality Committee to again request to proceed with rulemaking. And this would be scheduled to occur at their next meeting, which is in September. And that's kind of keeping it short, but that's all I had for you today. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Chris. Is there a high-level aspect of what the second part of the feedback was regarding the calculation of the numeric standards? I don't think the board here has any ability to help with the regulatory impact assessment portion of it, but if there were questions about the numeric calculation. Do you remember what was their concern about the regulatory, the calculation of the numbers?
I don't know specifically what they were asking. There were some concerns. There were some questions expressed about I think that the final toxicity values that were used and the basis of those values.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they elaborated any further on that outside the meeting.
Well, if any of that is something that we can help with, just let us know.
Will do.
Other questions for Chris? Again, it's interesting to see the movement of the science to rulemaking and then ultimately your implementation path forward for every individual facility, which will result in risk reduction, which was the goal. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's similar length groundwater.
Well, let's
take a break.
If yours is going to be short, let's take a break while you tee up the next two presentations. Can folks be back in 10 minutes? And by my clock, that will be, let's see, 11:37 7, 8. Great. I'll be back by 11:38. I understand that we'll be joined by next Bridget Shelton, who's going to do the groundwater portion of the standards update. We heard about drinking water standards and surface water standards and now groundwater standards.
Yeah. Just change the browser.
Morning, Bridget.
Morning. All right, thank you for having me. As mentioned, I'm Bridget Shelton, the Groundwater Standards Coordinator with the Division of Water Resources, here to provide a quick update on the PFAS rulemaking for the O2L groundwater quality standards. So we've presented to this board a number of times on North Carolina's groundwater quality standards. I wanted to provide a brief refresher on what these standards are and how they're developed. So groundwater standards are the maximum allowable concentrations, which may be tolerated without creating a threat to human health or which would otherwise render the groundwater unsuitable for its intended best usage. Best usage is defined in the rule as an existing or potential source of drinking water supply for humans. So these standards protect groundwaters of the state as a resource for human consumption. They are a state program. The North Carolina Rule 15A NCAC 02L 0202 provides the regulatory framework for these groundwater quality standards. So to develop a groundwater standard for a substance, we look at 6 criteria listed here in accordance with the rule. First, we have the systemic or the non-cancer threshold concentration. We use a reference dose to calculate this. Then we have a concentration which corresponds to an incremental lifetime cancer risk of 1 in a million. We use a cancer slope factor to calculate this. We then look at the taste and the odor threshold limit values and the federal maximum contaminant level. These are EPA's national primary drinking water regulations. And then the national secondary drinking water standards, again through EPA. These are non-enforceable standards that protect for organoleptic effects such as discoloration. So some of these are slides that we presented to the EMC. So as this board knows, PFAS are a group of manufactured chemicals. Specific concern to North Carolina, there's a significant presence and prevalence in North Carolina in large part due to their persistence in the environment, and they bioaccumulate in the environment as well as humans and animals. So for this rulemaking, DEQ evaluated the available scientific data to develop groundwater standards for a subset of PFAS. First, some background on EPA's recent PFAS actions. So over the last few years, from 2021 to 2023, EPA has finalized multiple toxicity assessments for a number of PFAS compounds. These have come from different programs within EPA, including the Office of Water and the Office of Research and Development. As discussed by Rebecca, in April 2024, the EPA finalized their national primary drinking water regulations, which established legally enforceable levels for drinking water called MCLs for 6 PFAS. I just pulled this from EPA's website, so you can see 5 compounds there have individual MCLs. 1 PFBS is regulated through a hazard index approach. So quickly to cover the rulemaking authority. So the Environmental Management Commission, the EMC, has a statutory authority to adopt groundwater standards under the Administrative Code 15A NCAC 02L. More information about the EMC and previous meeting materials are available at that link. The Groundwater and Waste Management Committee of the EMC must first approve the rule changes before they can proceed to the full EMC. So we first go to the committee to request their approval to then go to the full commission. So when EPA began to publish those finalized toxicity documents and take other actions, such as working on those national primary drinking water regulations, we began the process of developing groundwater standards, including presenting to the committee and the EMC to give them some background and to prepare them for this rulemaking. So in 2022 through 2023, we presented on a variety of items, including the prevalence of PFAS in North Carolina, EPA's actions, updates to the rulemaking process, as well as a detailed presentation by Franny on the proposed PFAS toxicological summary, so the toxicity references and data that we use to develop these standards. Then beginning in 2024, we began to present to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee at every meeting. They meet every other month. So mostly information items, again, on a variety of topics like the implementation requirements and expected timeline for implementation, an overview of the stakeholder meetings that were held earlier this year. And then in May, we did present the proposed groundwater standards, including an overview of the regulatory impact analysis, or an RIA, and that's a required document for rulemaking. In May, that was an information item, and then in July, we went back to the committee with an action item with the same information, proposed groundwater standards. We were requesting the committee to approve the rulemaking package to then go to the EMC. So here are the compounds initially proposed by DEQ for groundwater standards development. This is duplicate slide to Chris's, same 8 compounds, acronyms are here. And then 6 of those are currently regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act in the form of MCLs and a hazard index. Again, duplicate slide here. So why this subset of PFAS? The toxicity data is there. It has been reviewed by federal agencies. All 8 compounds have been detected in North Carolina, and we have a test method in order to measure these compounds in groundwater. So here's some more information on the compounds that we initially proposed for groundwater standards development. So we've included the references that we used as a basis for the development of these standards, the critical health effects we see in the literature, and the toxicity benchmarks and values available. So for the references here, these are finalized toxicity assessments from EPA, as well as from another federal agency, CDC's ATSDRs, minimal risk levels. The plus sign footnote here designates the references that are also used as the basis for EPA's PFAS National Primary Drinking Water Regulations. So finalized toxicity assessments that then went through a further review by EPA, including a Science Advisory Board review and a public comment. So these have been extensively reviewed. And then the last 2 were through EPA's Integrated Risk Information Systems program, IRIS assessments. For the toxicity benchmarks and values available to the right here, so you can see that some compounds have multiple values and benchmarks available. We have bolded the reference or the benchmark or value used in the development of the groundwater standards. The bolded value there represents the value that led to the lowest value. As a reminder, we establish as the least of those criteria there in order to be the most protective of human health. So you can see for PFOS and PFOA, we have a reference dose, a cancer slope factor, and an MCL available. The reference dose for PFOS led to the lower value, and the cancer slope factor for PFOA led to the lowest value. So this leads us to the groundwater standards initially proposed by DEQ in the left-hand column of this table, shown in parts per trillion. The middle column here shows the existing limit under the current O2L rule. So the O2L rule has language that says when there is no health-based groundwater standard in the rule for a substance, that substance is not allowed in the groundwater at or above the practical quantitation limit, or the PQL. So this is the case right now for any PFAS. We have no groundwater standards. So the existing O2L limit in this case is the PQL. As you all know, the PQL may change over time as laboratory capabilities improve. They may vary across labs. The PQL we have listed here as a reference was from EPA's Method 1633. The right-hand column here shows the compliance level under the proposed rule. So for PFOS and PFOA, you can see that the calculated health-based standard to the left there is quite low. It's actually lower than the PQL, or the reporting limit. So the O2L rule language accounts for this. So you can see to the right here, where the standard for a substance is less than the PQL, the detection of that substance at or above the PQL constitutes a violation of the standard. So for PFOS and PFOA, the compliance level under the proposed rule, because those proposed O2L standard health-based values are quite low, the compliance level would be the PQL. Those proposed O2L standards, 0.7 and 0.001 parts per trillion, would still be in the rule. The compliance level would just be the PQL. For compounds 3 through 8 here, the compliance level would be that proposed calculated health-based standard. So for the current rulemaking status, DEQ presented the rulemaking package, the proposed rule, and the RIA for 8 PFAS to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee as an action item in July 2024. The committee voted to have DEQ revise the rulemaking package to address proposed standards for only 3 PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, and Gen X, and then return to the committee with the agenda item as revised. DEQ is currently revising the proposed rule and the RIA accordingly, and we will resend to the Office of State Budget and Management for approval of that RIA. We plan to present the revised proposed rule and RIA for those 3 compounds to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee at their next meeting, which is September 2024, for approval to proceed to the EMC to then request public notice. So same table as shown before, as requested by the Groundwater Committee, Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. We will be proposing standards for these 3 compounds, PFOS, PFOA, and GenX, at the same values. The PQL language to the right still applies to PFOS and PFOA. For compounds 4 through 8 shown here, there will be no proposed standard, and the existing limit will continue to be the PQL as shown in the right-hand column. So here's the proposed rulemaking schedule if approved by the committee in September. If approved by the committee, we will then go to the EMC in November and request approval to go to public hearing and public comment. Public comment period would be December through February 2025. We would then go back to the EMC with that hearing officer's report and the final RIA to request that they adopt the rule. If approved, the proposed effective date would be in July of 2025. Thank you, and that is it for me.
Questions for Bridget on the groundwater quality standards path forward? Yeah, Jamie, please.
So I think I misunderstood on one of your slides. The commission does not want to consider standards for some of the PFAS and wants you to revise the proposed standards for only 3. They're not asking you to revise the other ones. They just said nope.
Yes, they do just want us to pursue standards for 3 compounds.
Did they provide any rationale for that you can share?
Clear.
Could you show us that slide again? Just remind us of what the 3rd one was. I saw the
This
first
one?
Yeah, gotcha. Yes, Detlef.
I'm always a little curious when it comes to the applicability of narrative standards versus a numerical standard. So is the PQL truly then an acceptable enforcement tool for DEQ for the other compounds?
It is in the rule. It is currently being used in implementation purposes, from my understanding. As I mentioned, the PQL can change. Every lab, it can be different, especially for PFAS. Over time, it has changed. So it is difficult sometimes to use.
But they don't tend to go up.
No,
How about I'll pause and see if there's any questions from Gina or Elena, if she's been able to hear us.
This is Gina. No questions. Thank you.
And Elena, be able to hear us now? I'm looking at Dylan since he's monitoring the chat.
No questions, and she's following along using the closed caption.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. And then the last update we have, which was also touched upon by Assistant Secretary Mace Moore, is an update on the legislative request for a DEQ dive into 1,4-dioxane, for which a couple of board members were pulled in to assist, although it was an unofficial board action item.
Right. Good morning. It's nice to present to everyone again. It's nice to not be the only presenter at this meeting. My name's Franny. I'm the environmental toxicologist at DEQ. And today I'm going to give you a summary of this human health risk assessment report for 1,4-dioxane in drinking water that DEQ completed earlier this year as a result of the legislative directive from the General Assembly. 1,4-dioxane is a contaminant of emerging concern and of concern that we don't hear about as much as PFAS, but it is of equal importance. 1,4-dioxane kind of came onto everyone's radar when the EPA issued their third iteration of the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule in 2012. This third iteration required monitoring of 30 different contaminants, and 1,4-dioxane was one of them. So this was monitored all across the country as a result of this big program the EPA does, and the results were published in 2017. The map on this slide is from a peer-reviewed publication detailing the UCMR3 data. I'll orient you to the map before I talk about the text around it. So it's a map of the US. There are 3 different kinds of dots on the map. The clear circles are detections or samples that were below the minimal reporting limit. So they were very low, perhaps detectable, but not quantifiable or quantitatable. The gray circles are samples that were above the minimal reporting limit, but below the reference concentration this publication used. And the reference concentration is 0.35 micrograms per liter. It's a health-based concentration. And then the red circles are the measurements that were above that reference concentration. In this publication, the authors look at all of the public water systems that were sampled, and there were 5 states that had the most public water systems with exceedances of the 1,4-dioxane reference concentration. North Carolina was one of them, with the fourth highest number of public water systems that exceeded this value. These were not individual measurements, this was a water system. So 24 different systems in North Carolina exceeded this value. We looked at the data in another way, and so the UCMR3 data led these high-ranking states to reevaluate all of these industrial sources and look into their water quality monitoring, their standards, their discharge, permitting, all of that as a result of this big monitoring program. This table here shows the states along the first column, the number of detections, percent detections, and North Carolina is third in this table, not because of the number of individual detections, which was not the highest of all of the states, but we had the third highest value of 1,4-dioxane measured in the country. And so that is the 6th column. And so the 8.8 was the third highest value measured nationally. As a result of the UCMR3 monitoring program, a lot of states, especially the ones that had higher detections, entered into new monitoring and sampling for 1,4-dioxane. And so North Carolina certainly did that. These are 5 different wastewater treatment facilities that we've had discharge sampling either through a certain period of time or ongoing from the end of UCMR3 when the data was published through present. And so some of them started in 2019 and 2 others started in 2021 and 2022, but this monitoring has been going on pretty consistently since that point. As far as the legislative report, this is just a very quick timeline that I'll get into some of the details. This came about in September of 2023, where the General Assembly directed DEQ to prepare this report for a human health risk assessment of 1,4-dioxane in drinking water, supported by peer review studies. In December of 2023, we came to the SAB and asked for some guidance on how to do this in such a short time. There were several recommendations the board gave us, and one of them was to use an abridged version of the full human health risk assessment and one that was fit for regulatory purposes. And so in January, we started following that guidance. We put together a group of experts and began the directive activities of compiling this report. We finished this report and delivered it to the Joint Legislative Commission on Governmental Operations on May 1st, which was the deadline for this report. The overall approach that we took for this report followed the EPA's Human Health Risk Assessment Guidance for Decision-Making, this framework. And kind of contained in this bigger circle is the classic risk assessment. My pointer's not showing up. Is the classic risk assessment paradigm. So the exposure assessment, the effects assessment, and the risk characterization. But really what this framework does is ensure that the problem formulation and all of the pieces that go before the risk assessment are really fit for the purpose of the decision making or the decision that is being made based on the result of this assessment. And so throughout the entire process, we were evaluating the data and the things that were included to make sure they were fit for the purpose of answering the legislative directive. So the approach we took was to follow this framework to evaluate the cancer risk of 1,4-dioxane in drinking water in North Carolina. The goal was to deliver this report by May 1st, which we did earlier this year. There were a number of people involved in this, and so the work group we had that was compiling the body of the report consisted really of these 5 people. And so we had 3 people from DEQ that were very well versed in the 1,4-dioxane monitoring, the data curation, and then presentation and data analysis. And then Dr. Kenyon, who is one of the SAB board members, and myself worked together to compile the effects assessment, which is the toxicological piece of this puzzle. Those 2 things come together to inform the risk characterization. Alongside the people that were doing the work of this report, we had several people on the outside that we were seeking guidance from throughout the process. And so after the report was done and throughout each step in the process, we had Dr. Linda Birnbaum reviewing each piece of this puzzle along the way, and then also she reviewed the entire document at the end. And she is a human health expert and has a lot of experience with 1,4-dioxane. And then I'm sure you remember I sent this report to all of you for your review. Along the way, we also had a lot of folks from DHHS kind of advising this process, and we just wanted to make sure the questions we were asking and the way that we were going about this process and inclusion of the health data was appropriate and sufficient, and to make sure we didn't leave any important pieces out. And so they were all very critical in the success of this report. I'm going to go through the different pieces of this report. And so I've pulled out just a very simple risk assessment diagram, so we don't have to look at the bigger one. But this is really the same. And so the first 2 pieces, the hazard identification and the dose response assessment, are the effects assessment piece of this. That combined with an exposure assessment informs this big risk characterization, which will answer the legislative directive. Using this human health risk assessment framework for decision making, a big part of this specific framework is to thoroughly plan out this entire process and ensure that all pieces of this puzzle serve the directive. And so we're using data and analysis methods and metrics that serve the purpose for decision making. As far as the exposure assessment goes, we were really seeking to just describe the prevalence and exposure to 1,4-dioxane in North Carolina, and then estimate the impacted population using environmental occurrence and drinking water. All of this data that was available to DEQ and some that we sought from external parties, different utilities that allowed us to incorporate their data. The method for doing this was really just to compare our environmental occurrence data to our drinking water data and calculate percent detections above the national average that was reported in the UCMR3 data. The metric for this analysis was really just that comparison and to just decide whether our exposure is average or irregular based on the mean and standard deviation of those values. Each piece of this report had a significant data quality section. And so the data quality metrics are very clearly laid out in this EPA framework, but really it's just to make sure that the data is scientifically sound, that it has been evaluated and reviewed prior to its inclusion, and that it is fit for the purpose, it's fit for this use. And so all of the data we included met these requirements. And so there are just checkboxes along here for all the different data sets that were included. But you can see that there were a lot of different unique data sets that were compiled for this analysis. What I'm showing you now are some maps that Jared made, kind of just depicting the data that we used. And so I'll orient you before I talk about it. The maps are oriented horizontally. And so across the top, there are two maps, the environmental occurrence and the drinking water data from 2014 to 2021. And this is while the UCMR3 program was going on, shortly thereafter, and before any regulatory efforts were put in place in North Carolina. The bottom two maps, also moving horizontally, are the environmental occurrence and the drinking water incidences. But these are from 2022 to the end of 2023 when we started this effort. And this is the data that is reflective of post-regulatory efforts. So there are different orders of consent and voluntary efforts in place, and that's why the two maps look different. The legend on the map is a little small, so I'll read it to you. The green dots on the map are either 0 net micrograms per liter or not detected. The yellow dots are less than the US average based on the UCMR3 data, which is 0.45. And then the red dots are greater than the US average of 0.45. So the red dots are above the health-based value the EPA has released and also above the national average. The environmental occurrence data includes surface water data and wastewater data, as well as drinking water utility data that is raw water intake data. So it's not finished drinking water data. And so it's coming right from the surface water or groundwater into the facility. That is all included in the environmental occurrence panels. The drinking water incidence panels include only drinking water utility finished water. So it's been through the drinking water facilities. And the measurement is from the post-filtration and post-processing sampling point. If you look at the maps, you can see that the top left panel has a lot of detections. This is environmental data from before any regulatory efforts were put in place. The environmental occurrence data below that is after these regulatory efforts were put in place, and you can see this map looks different. There are still red circles that are above the national US concentration, average concentration in the US, but there are less of them, and they're mostly located in one region of the state. If you go back up to the top and look at the right panel, you can see the drinking water incidences before any regulatory efforts were put in place. There are some big red circles, but far less than there are in the environmental occurrence data. And then if you look at the bottom right panel, this is the drinking water data after the regulatory efforts were put in place. And you can see this map looks very different than the one diagonally across from it. So the original environmental occurrence data, but also the drinking water data before any regulatory efforts were put in place. These regulatory efforts changed the way this map looks and lowered a lot of 1,4-dioxane concentrations, both in the environment and in our finished drinking water. To summarize our exposure data, and this comes right from the report, so forgive me for all of the words on the slide, but these data indicate that most North Carolinians outside of the Cape Fear River Basin are not exposed to 1,4-dioxane concentrations above the national average. Some of those who are exposed within the Cape Fear River Basin are exposed to the third highest drinking water concentrations in the nation. The regulatory attention focused to reduce these concentrations led to decreased 1,4-dioxane in environmental and drinking water exposures in the Cape Fear River Basin. And the public outreach efforts regarding 1,4-dioxane exposure in drinking water resulted in a lot of locations in North Carolina decreasing their 1,4-dioxane exposure outside of the Cape Fear River Basin due to their voluntary efforts and actions to reduce 1,4-dioxane once they knew it was a problem. The next section of this assessment was the effects assessment. And so The way we planned this out was just to compare the existing assessments and evaluate the quality of any new studies or data for this application of a health-based guidance value. The method was to summarize existing and relevant new literature, if it exists, and compare this data to what they derive the health-based guidance values on. And then the metric for our analysis was to compare any new data to the EPA guidance for these health-based values, so how they derived these health-based endpoints. Again, there's a big data quality section, and I'm not gonna go through all of this. The take home here was we had a bunch of five different federal guidance documents, not all from the US. So there was one from Europe and one from Canada, and then 3 from the EPA. One was an update to an original IRIS document, and then there was a recent TSCA evaluation that was done. We evaluated all 5 of these, and based on their relevance and fit for purpose, not all of them qualified. And there were some pieces of the TSCA, the ECA, and the 2013 IRIS update that were not relevant to this. The 2013 IRIS update included a lot of inhalation information, but none of the oral exposure data was changed. So the new pieces in 2013 were not relevant. It was still the same oral exposure reference dose. The TSCA value has a different purpose. It's not for a lifetime exposure value. It is an occupational exposure, and it includes a lot of different things other than just oral exposure. And so that wasn't fit for the right purpose either. The values, because it's based on different exposures, were actually a lot lower than the IRIS values. And then the ECA report also includes occupational exposures, and so we didn't include that either. It was really the EPA IRIS document compared to the Canada 2021 document that we were looking at for this section. This big table is really how we analyzed these different reports and just compared the same metrics across these reports. So the IRIS assessment has a cancer value and a non-cancer value, so a cancer slope factor and a reference dose. The Health Canada report only provided a non-cancer value, despite clearly stating that it is they did a cancer analysis but chose to use a non-cancer value. And then we also compared this to the ATSDR non-cancer value, just so there was another metric of comparison. This is an abridged table. There's a larger table in the appendix of this report that's available online, but this is just for comparison, so you can see the differences in their report. I'm not going to go through the pieces of the table. But essentially, the hazard identification was just a comparison of these different documents information. And then the dose response analysis was an evaluation of the way that cancer slope factors are derived and the differences between these different sources. This section really highlighted that the EPA and Health Canada assessments do agree that oral exposure to 1,4-dioxane causes carcinogenic effects in the liver, and that the carcinogenic liver effects, mode of action, are the most well understood. The IRIS assessment provides the most consistent value across regulated chemicals because it is frequently used in federal and state regulatory programs. There have only been a few peer-reviewed publications since both of these assessments were produced, and there's not enough additional information to support a change in the way these values are extrapolated. And all of those details are listed in the report, but I'm not going to go into the different modeling approaches right now. And finally, the cancer slope factor provided by the EPA IRIS assessment was in fact derived using the most health protecting modeling approach, and provides science-based protection to North Carolinians from 1,4-dioxane exposure in their drinking water. The risk characterization section is really the combination of exposure and effects, and the way we did this was to compare the existing exposure data with the health-based guidance values for protection from cancer. The method we used was to determine the risk based on the extent to which the drinking water concentration, the 95% confidence interval of the mean values, being what people are exposed to. And if this is above the health-based value or the water quality standard that was calculating using our 2B rules that Chris talked about, based on this cancer slope factor. We also used a margin of exposure calculation, which was a really interesting way to look at this. And I think it helped explain a lot of the exposure differences to those of us that are not toxicologists. The metric we used was just the percent of this data that is above this water quality or health protective value. And we use the magnitude of protection from this margin of exposure calculation to compare to the UCMR3 data and determine how North Carolina's risk compares to the national risk. Here is a box plot graph. And so I'll orient you here first. On the y-axis, we have 1,4-dioxane concentration. And then across the bottom in these very small box plots are the same 4 categories of data that we had on the map. So there's pre-regulatory efforts, post-regulatory efforts, and then UCMR3, North Carolina data, and then the national data, so a little bit different. But this is the UCMR3 data. This is not the combination of all of the data we used. These were just for comparison. You can see that the pre-regulatory efforts had a very wide range of concentrations, and the other 3 categories had values that were outside of the very narrow box plot, but not to the extent that the values were being reported in 2021. The red line is the grand mean across, or no, sorry, the red line is the health-based value. So that's 0.35. All of the means essentially were over what the health-based value is. What this graph tells us is that while the drinking water in North Carolina is a source of 1,4-dioxane exposure, at higher concentrations than the national values, which are the UCMR3 data, the entire country is exposed to 1,4-dioxane at concentrations that are above the value that is predictive to be protective of cancer effects in 1 in a million people, so 0.35. The UCMR national data, which is the far right little box plot, compared to just North Carolina right next to it, they're a little different, but both above what the protective value would be. In order to look at this a different way, this is where we employed the margin of exposure calculation. And this is a complicated analysis and one that I was fairly new to. And so I'm going to explain it as succinctly as I can, but it is explained in detail in this report because I wanted to make sure it was clearly explained and I wasn't leaving any pieces out that were important. So for this kind of a calculation, you take the mean drinking water value in milligrams per liter. So I had to convert first, that's what those first 2 columns are. And then you use the estimated daily exposure, which is calculated using exposure factors. So amount of drinking water per day, body weight, and then the drinking water value. What this results in is an estimated daily exposure. And that is divided by the benchmark dose that is used in the modeling approach. So those values are divided by each other, and then you get what is called a margin of exposure factor. And that is what is in the 4th column. These are really big numbers. And essentially, if you have a value over 10,000, it's considered protective. And so all of these values were over that margin of exposure or protectiveness, but there's clearly a difference in all of these different values. And so the values were the UCMR3 data from North Carolina, the national UCMR3 data, pre and post regulatory efforts, and then also our derived water quality standard. That's a health-based value based on the EPA's assessment. These large numbers in this column told us the magnitude of protection, but it didn't tell us a lot of, and it's a complicated way to translate this information. And so what we did was we took these margin of exposure factors and just divided them over what our derived water quality standard based on the cancer slope factor would be. And so, for example, we took the UCMR 3 North Carolina data, which is a value of 1,252,771, and put it over the 3 million value that is the water quality standard. And that resulted in 38%. And so this is a 38% protectiveness, this value compared to what our water quality standard would be based on the cancer slope factor. This is a unique way of looking at this, and we did this so it was easier for us to explain the difference in exposure and protection. If you look down this column, you can see the North Carolina UCMR value, so 0.45 is where that 1 million number comes from, is, I mean, only 38% as protective as this water quality standard would be. The pre-regulatory effort value is only 14% as protective as this other value would be. And then 21% for the post-regulatory efforts. The national UCMR 3 data was actually the closest to our water quality standard, with 78% of the protection that value would offer. But then the 100% is just the water quality standard divided by itself, which is 1. Are there any questions about this? I know this is not the normal way to do this, but we were trying to figure out a way to explain this easily.
I remember all of us have seen this as a draft
That's true.
earlier too, so.
So the summary is just that this report uses exposure data and health-based values for cancer endpoints and dose response information to determine how the risk in North Carolina compared to the national risk. Based on this risk assessment, it's concluded that North Carolina's residents are exposed to 1,4-dioxane in concentrations that may be 2 times the national average in drinking water and as much as 4 times the national averages in surfaces and groundwater. Based on the UCMR 3 data, North Carolinians experienced approximately half the protection than the rest of the nation received from 1,4-dioxane in their drinking water during the UCMR 3 program. All of that and more is available here on our website in this Human Health Risk Assessment report. It's available here at this link. That's all. It's longer than I thought it would be. I can take any questions.
Well, thank you. It was a Herculean amount of effort in a short period of time as mandated by the legislative language. Are there questions for Franny on the report or how it was received by the folks that requested it?
Did you get any feedback from the General Assembly?
Did we get any feedback from the General Assembly?
So
This is Sushma Mazemore. I would say let's wait to see because they've been in session, they've had other priorities. And I'm sure that if we get questions, it may come when they have a little bit of time. We did offer the Environmental Management Commission an opportunity to have this report be summarized and synthesized for them, but we're still waiting for a response.
in the short period of time, I think the things that we're focused on, that would be unique to North Carolina, summarizing existing exposure data, unique to North Carolina, and then a look at anything that was new, literature-wise, since the existing toxicological assessments was value added, the cross-regulatory agency comparison was value added, and then the synthesis was all value added. So in a short period of time, it seems like it not only met the legislative mandate, but moved things along as well, instead of just a review of existing information. Any other questions for Franny? Detlef, yeah.
It's maybe more common, and averages are sometimes useful, but I want to just highlight that even the UCMR 3 data only applied to systems, I think, serving more than 10,000 people. And the one community that's most heavily impacted by all this is Pittsboro. And as recently as 2019, we measured in a 1-week composite sample over 100 micrograms per liter 1,4-dioxane in their drinking water. And so I think one key focus of this entire action really should be on on that community, right? So, and there are people that are at higher risk than others in these types of analyses.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that we were trying to do the comparison at the end was to these larger values to show how North Carolina compares. But the Pittsburgh drinking water system, I can't remember what the name of it actually is, but they provided us data, and that was included in the environmental occurrence as well as the drinking water data for both pre and post regulatory efforts. So they are represented on that map. And that is likely where some of those red dots remain.
And they'd be represented in those box and whisker plots too. I mean, one way to look at it is that there's few outliers, but they're real numbers up there, right?
Yeah, sort of. And I think there's some data that we have that didn't make it into the report, maybe because we don't use an official method. But I also want to say that there has been a lot of positive impact when we look at average concentrations in the different Cape Fear systems. The annual averages have gone down, including in Pittsburgh.
They have, and there were a few different entities that I reached out to because either their data was published in a report or there was summary information on their website, and I was trying to get their actual data files to incorporate and include in our map, and I didn't hear back from several of them. So we did reach out further than the data sets we did acquire, but not everybody was able to provide us the files, especially in the short time frame we needed them in.
Yeah, was it quite the tight time frame. Yeah, well, it sounds like it was a good effort in terms of not just synthesizing what's available, but setting a foundation for risk management decisions moving forward with the combination of local trends, that diagonal comparison of, raw water versus finished water, pre and post. That's helpful for risk management, as well as the effects assessment portion, that synthesizes what a protective value would be and what the differences of those would be practically. Any other questions for Franny? All right. I'll ask before we break for lunch, are we on a time schedule for the afternoon presentations? I know that we're joined by Jamie for one of those updates. How about the other one?
Dr. Connolly said he would be here around 12:30, and so he'll be here in time after lunch.
Okay. That may mean that we need to stay pretty close to schedule then. Jamie, how long is your update?
I can make that as long or as short as you all would like.
Well,
I could do 5 minutes. I
I'd
could
say
do
it's
20
yours
minutes.
and we can make time for whatever time you think is needed. I know you have, you said some limitations on what you're allowed to share. What did you have in mind? We're not pinched for time. I'm just looking at.
I could probably do it. 10 minutes would be great. 5 minutes is doable.
Now let's make it 15 minutes and let's say that we'll come back then be ready to start at 1:15.
Okay.
And then we'll do Jamie's and then we'll wrap that up in time for Justin to join at 12. You said 1:30?
Oh, he said he would be here during our lunch period and be ready to.
And
go.
then ready to do it at any time? All right. Can you check with him and see if he needs to go first?
Well,
All right. So let's come back at 1:15. 1:15, ready to go. Thanks. Start this afternoon with a couple of presentations on PFMOAA. And if you recall, the board was asked by DEQ to look at the toxicological literature for that compound back in 2022 when there were 2 studies available, and the board concluded after a few months of digging into those that they did not yet serve as an adequate information base from which to derive a reference dose. But we were aware that there were some things on the horizon and said that we would revisit it and try to stay abreast of any new developments. Under the state's PFAS action strategy, they're trying to maximize the use of the work that EPA and others are doing for national level of efforts. But PFMOAA is one of those compounds that's not being covered at that level. So it'll be important for North Carolina to stay apprised of what's going on in the academic community, as well as the government research. So we have two updates on that compound today. And I think the first one is going to be from Justin Conley with EPA. And Justin is a reproductive systems biologist investigating the developmental and reproductive toxicity of PFAS and other chemicals. He's a product of North Carolina's academic system with an undergraduate degree from Warren Wilson College in the western part of the state and his doctorate from right here in Raleigh at NC State. So thanks for joining us, Justin.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate Franny and the board's invitation to come talk about the work, some of the work we've been doing at EPA. So Franny had specifically asked me to talk about this paper on PFMOA that we published at the beginning of this year. And so the title of this talk is just the title of the paper. Here's a snapshot of it. It's available online. You can send copies to anybody who would want one. So I'm going to kind of basically just go through a real, very, very brief introduction and then kind of walk through the data from the paper at a fairly high level, just my interpretation and kind of what we reported, to allow time for any specific focused questions at the end. And then so I'll wrap up with kind of my broader interpretations of what the data means. So just real basically, if you don't know who I am or what we do, I'm in the US EPA Office of Research and Development. And so specifically, I'm in the reproductive and developmental toxicology branch. So our focus is on toxicity or hazard assessment of environmental chemicals. And we have a very high level of focus on exposures during pregnancy and the effects on maternal and fetal or offspring health. And so I've worked for many years now with Dr. Earl Gray, who's a longstanding toxicologist in the field. And we've published many papers on phthalates, and pesticides, and have transitioned into a lot of PFAS work since about 2018. So we've published quite a few papers already. There's a lot more work that we haven't published yet, and as well as a few mixture studies. So I'll touch on specifically PFMOA here. So we study PFAS developmental effects because they're very well recognized and described in the literature to have both epidemiological associations as well as strong animal data showing a range of maternal adverse health effects as well as adverse health effects on offspring. These are a couple kind of convenient diagrams put together by the North Carolina PFAS testing network that I often use that just highlight some of the rodent effects as well as some of the adverse effects in pregnant women. It's pretty important that it is an extremely dynamic and complex life stage or period of life, pregnancy. There are big changes from early pregnancy to late pregnancy. There's a lot of interaction across the maternal, placental, and fetal interface. And so the ways that PFAS that we've studied move and the effects they produce are really highly complex and not particularly well characterized. And I think really importantly, and specifically for this talk right here, is that most PFAS outside of the most classic ones have not been studied in vivo mammalian developmental toxicity assays. So that's where our work comes in. Kind of very broadly, one area of focus of our work is to study the emerging compounds that we see in the literature showing up with high detection rates in drinking water or in human serum. To our group, that sort of immediately identifies it as being a high priority compound because we know that exposure is occurring. And we specifically try to focus on compounds that also are very data poor or even completely data deficient in the literature. And so among the kind of emerging PFAS, obviously, let me see if I can get a laser pointer here. So PFMOA is one of these emerging PFAS. Broadly, the way I think about it is most of the emerging PFAS that are being reported in the monitoring studies, to me, sort of fall into two rather broad categories. The top one up here, what I'm calling the long chain per and polyfluoroalkyl ether compounds. So Nafion byproduct 2 is well known in the Wilmington cohort in Lower Cape Fear region. We've published on this compound. Somewhat recently, the NC State studies have reported high detection frequencies of these very long-chain multi-ether compounds, PFO5-DOA and PFO4-DA. Very crudely, these long-chain compounds typically have low detection frequencies in surface waters or drinking waters, but very high detection frequencies in human serum and exposed populations. So the Wilmington cohorts had 99% detection of all three of these compounds up here, but very low or infrequent detections in surface water or drinking water, and then somewhat opposed to the short chain compounds that are also being used as replacements in manufacturing. These compounds tend to have rather strikingly high environmental concentrations, very frequent detections, but commonly have little or no detection in human samples. So the assumption here is that the long chain compounds have long half-lives, high bioaccumulation potential, and the shorter chain compounds are excreted rather quickly and often may not even be detectable in serum. And so PFMOA is one of these compounds, and we've done some studies with other ones here. And so kind of putting into context, long chain, long half-life versus short chain, short half-life. I'll talk about that towards the end. Okay, so this particular study, one of the main objectives of our work is also to build up and do more and more complex mixture studies. And so rigorous laboratory mixtures work is really predicated on having individual chemical dose response data from essentially identical study protocols. So we published on GenX in 2018, doing, basically this pregnant rat model where we're dosing from gestation day 8. So this is essentially when the embryo implants in the uterine wall and the fetus begins developing. So we're dosing for all of fetal development through delivery and just to the second day postnatally. So it's 17 total days of exposure, which encompasses all of fetal development. And then we collect a lot of endpoints on the moms and on the offspring, both immediately at birth and at 2 days of age. And we do all of these studies in dose response, as that's critical for being directly translatable to risk assessment and being able to derive benchmark responses and benchmark doses for risk assessment and regulatory purposes. So this is a very, repeated study design that we've used across 8 or 9 different compounds at this point. And so just really quickly to go through the results of this study with PFM-OAA. This isn't a figure. The data is all reported in the supplemental file. There's means and standard errors and sample sizes for everything we measured. But this is really important just to see, okay, are the adverse effects that I'm going to show you in later slides associated with just high doses that caused the maternal rats to be sick? And so you can see that we have our doses from control to high dose on the x-axis. This is body weight gain during pregnancy, and so there's no difference from controls all the way through the highest dose. And then dam body weight on postnatal day 2, so this is after they've delivered, and oftentimes this is really the best indicator of whether or not you've just caused overt toxicity in the maternal animals, and you can see there's no difference in body weight across all doses. So this is really ideally what we would see in a developmental study, that we're not just producing overt toxicity in the mom and that any effects are really compound mechanism specific. So this is the first figure from the paper. And so this is dose response data that you may use in a benchmark dose analysis and derivation. The top left is showing the reduction in pup body weight at 2 days of age. So we have there's significant low birth weight, they're significantly lower in weight at 1 day of age and at 2 days of age. We also have a significant reduction in pup survival. So there is increased pup mortality, which we've published happens with GenX, it happens with Nafion byproduct 2, it happens with PFAS, it happens with PFOA. And there's a number of reasons why this potentially happens that we continue to investigate. The top right panel is liver weight. All of the PFAS we've studied induce liver toxicity. And so what I'm showing you here, the dotted line is absolute pup liver weight, and you'll notice how it goes up. And then there's a high dose non-monotonic effect here. And essentially what's happening is at these high doses, these pups are pretty sick. The liver is no longer really responding and going through hyperplasia. And likely if we continued the exposure longer, these pups, a number of them probably would not make it. But so at the lower doses, we do have apparent liver increase. The solid line is if we correct for the body weight of the pups. So we have a very significant large increase in liver weight. And then the blue line is maternal liver weight. So both the moms and the pups have increased liver weights. The bottom left and right panels are circulating total thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3 thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormone concentrations, from what I've seen, are becoming more and more the benchmark response because they're quite sensitive responses in rodent studies, and they're considered adverse by a number of state and federal risk assessment and regulatory agencies. And so we see a very nice significant dose-responsive decline in both T3 and T4 and both moms and pups that are 2 days old. This is all pup data, kind of in a, I like to use these, they're called violin plots. I think it's just the most transparent way to show your data. I'm showing you all of the litter means and the full spread of all the data, so you can see how variable or not it is. The top left is newborn pup liver glycogen. I won't go into this too deeply, but it's something I'm interested in that we've studied more and more. Essentially, at term, one of the most important things the fetus does is store a lot of glucose in the form of glycogen in the liver, and this is basically all of the fuel the pup will largely use at birth to power thermogenesis and brain function and all of the critical things that a newborn has to do once it enters into the world. And so having this decline in glycogen storage is fatal in humans, and it contributes to, I think, some of the adverse effects we see in our pups, certainly. And then, as you might expect, this is newborn pup serum glucose, and so these pups are hypoglycemic, significant at the top 2 doses, as we would expect because their glycogen storage is reduced so much. We also have a rather large increase in serum total cholesterol in 2-day-old pups. A lot of the epidemiology data reports significant correlations with increased PFOA and PFOS exposure in adult total cholesterol, and we see really dramatically increased serum cholesterol concentrations in 2-day-old pups. That we're continuing to study this more. And then associated with the liver weight increases, the 2-day-old pups also have increases in serum total aspartate aminotransferase, AST. So this is a serum clinical chemistry indicator of liver damage. It's often considered important to have both an indicator of liver damage like increased serum AST along with liver weight increase to indicate that it is a true adverse effect. We look at gene expression in moms and pups in all of our studies. This is a way for us to understand what signaling pathways may or may not be involved. I won't dwell on this too much, but my goal here was, we published this data over here was all published for Gen X in our Gen X paper several years ago. And essentially what I did was put it side by side with equivalent pup samples from this PFMOA study. And so this is a heat map showing upregulation or downregulation of a range of genes in newborn pup liver. And kind of the general point is that you can see that the upper panels are what I want you to focus on. I can tell you about the bottom ones, but I think just for the sake of time, essentially the genes that are highly upregulated by Gen X in newborn pup liver are the same genes that are upregulated in newborn pup liver from PFMOA, indicating that they're acting mechanistically on the same signaling pathways. This figure is in the supplemental file, and I think it's important in this context. So we measure serum concentration of all of the test chemicals in both moms and pups, or moms and fetuses, depending on our study design. We also typically quantify liver as well. But so this is where I'm showing oral maternal dose on the x-axis, and this is serum PFMOA concentration on the y-axis. Both are log transformed, and we would expect, a linear increase on a log-log axis like this. And so the blue dots and blue line are the pup serum levels at 2 days of age, and the red squares and the red line are the maternal levels. So you can see at 2 days, at PND2, the mom levels are about an order of magnitude higher than the pup levels. This, I'm sure, has something to do with lactational transfer or lack thereof, but I don't want to expound on that too much because it's not something that we've studied directly. But the pup serum levels are lower. So for a bit of context, to my knowledge, there is no data that I've seen published that has human serum PFMOA concentrations. That the studies that have been done so far, I know the original GenX exposure study, the Kotlar 2020 paper, they actually didn't analyze for PFMOA because of an analytical issue. So it's not that it wasn't there, it's what that they did not analyze for it specifically. The only other paper that I've been aware of is this Yao et al. Recent paper from 2023. So this is in Shandong province in China, and they report a maximum, the highest level they found was 0.158 microgram per mil. And just to put that into context with this study here, the mean serum level at the lowest dose in the pups was 6.7 microgram per mil. So if you just divide those two numbers, you're looking at about a 42-fold margin of exposure. But it's important to remember that this exposure level doesn't represent a NOEL. There were multiple statistically significant adverse effects at that dose. So a 42-fold margin of exposure is not particularly high. But this again is the highest level that I could find in a human serum. I came from a comparative lab at NC State, and so I really like looking at cross compounds. I think there's a lot of value in putting data side by side, especially from identical protocols. So this is what I decided to put in the paper here. What I'm showing you is the dosimetry differences between the classic PFOA, which is in the orange triangles, the data here for PFMOAA in the red squares, and then GenX or HFPODA in the blue circles. So the PFOA and GenX data we've already published. It's out there in other papers. I just co-opted it into this paper for comparison. And so you can see PND2 at the end of the study, we used essentially about the same maternal oral doses in our studies across all three of these compounds. And you can see that GenX is much lower in serum concentration than the other two, and that PFMOA and PFOA reach about the same maternal serum concentration. This is paired maternal liver samples, and so you can see that PFOA is the highest in maternal liver after 17 days of dosing during pregnancy. PFMOA is just slightly below that, and then GenX is lower. If we just compare a ratio of these liver levels to these serum levels, one would be equivalent concentration on a part per million basis between the two compartments. And so essentially what you see here is that PFMOA does not accumulate in the liver compared to GenX. I don't actually think accumulates in the liver quite as much as it looks like here. It's just that it's so rapidly excreted from the serum that we have the higher ratios for GenX. And then at least in the female rat, it's essentially near equivalency for PFOA. But again, for PFMOA, we don't see any indications that it's like a liver accumulator. There's a lot of, maybe I should have just picked one of these, but the whole point of it is, again, I'm just showing you the data side by side. The higher level point is that PFOA, GenX, and PFMOA all produce the same maternal and pup effects. And this is just the dose response data plotted a couple different ways. If you want to look at it on a maternal oral dose basis in milligram per kilogram per day, here's data for 5 endpoints across the top. I do think it's important to note that there are pretty big molecular weight differences for these 3 compounds. PFMOA is very small. It's 180 grams per mole, whereas PFOA is more than twice as big. And so on a mass basis, there's actually quite a bit more PFMOA at a given serum concentration or oral dose than there is of PFOA. And so the whole bottom plots are the exact same data. I'm showing you the dose response for the 3 chemicals based on maternal serum concentration, and those maternal serum concentrations reported as on a micromolar basis. And so what you can see is that Gen X is at least in the female rat developmental studies, Gen X is considerably the most potent, especially for maternal liver weight. It's very, very potent. And then for a number of endpoints, PFMOA is pretty similar in potency to PFOA, or just slightly less potent than PFOA, maybe by about a half a log or a log unit, depending on the endpoint. But all the effects are essentially the same across these carboxylate compounds. And so if we take those dose response curves and pick a response level, like let's say, I think we used a 10% response compared to control, and calculate potency factors. So you're just using PFOA as the index chemical, so it has a potency of 1. If you're to the left of this line, you're less potent than PFOA, and if to the right of this line, you're more potent than PFOA. And this is the same data, showing you these potency factors based on oral maternal dose or based on maternal serum on a micromolar basis. And so what you can see is that PFMOA is about 3 to 7-fold weaker than PFOA based on the maternal serum concentrations, except for pup liver weight, where it's just slightly more potent. And then you're seeing what I showed you in those dose response, that Gen X is much more potent for a number of effects. So this is indicating that there's not a big difference in the serum-based potencies between PFMOA and PFOA. Now, to put that into context, from a risk assessment perspective, the elimination rate of these compounds between humans and between test animals and across sexes is a major factor in putting these potency differences and interpreting risk into the appropriate contexts. So just for example here, there is no data on the elimination rates of PFMOA, but PFBA, which is a straight chain compound that has nearly the same molecular weight as PFMOA, has been studied, and the PFBA half-life in the female rat is 1 to 2 hours. It's eliminated very, very quickly. And the PFBA half-life in humans is about 70 to 80 hours. So it's also quick in the context of what we know about a lot of other PFAS. So in general, it seems that PFMOA is excreted very quickly in a female rat and pretty quickly in humans. In contrast, where I showed you those potency difference between PFMOA and PFOA, PFOA has a half-life in the female rat of about 2 to 10 hours, also very quick. Whereas in humans, we know the PFOA half-life is somewhere, there's a lot of argument about this, but somewhere in the 2 to 10 year, much, much longer half-life, much higher opportunity for bioaccumulation. And so the ability to achieve those internal doses that I was showing you in those rat studies, to achieve those internal doses in a human population or a human exposure, is going to be much greater for the compounds that have longer human half-lives. And that those with shorter human half-lives, it would take a much higher oral exposure to reach those internal concentrations producing effects. And so I do want to caveat that by saying, just because something is eliminated rapidly doesn't mean that it's no risk or no harm, that it really is dependent on the exposure levels. And I know that James McCord's paper from 2018, where we first saw some of the estimated drinking water levels of PFMOA, they were at approximately 10,000 nanogram per liter. That's a really high drinking water level for any compound. And so those have certainly, to my knowledge, gone down, but at least the early data indicated pretty high exposure. And so in that case, even if it is rapidly eliminated, but it's at a high level in your drinking water every day, that doesn't necessarily mean it may not produce adverse effects. This is my last slide. Main points are just that, what I tried to show in the paper was that at least in our study protocol, in our hands, doing the rat developmental studies that, PFOA, GenX, PFMOA, they all produce the same effects in both the maternal and fetal or neonatal animals. We've also published studies, like I said, on PFAS and Nafion byproduct 2, which are sulfonates. And so the functional group, carboxylates versus sulfonates, are really the primary drivers. There's a lot of overlap between those two broad categories, but there are some differences. That the newer emerging compounds that have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 ether bonds do not really seem to change the hazard profile necessarily. That they produce, essentially the same effects as the straight chain compounds, but that chain length and molecular weight plays a really large role in how quickly they're eliminated, and that there are major species and sex differences that have to be accounted for when you're trying to interpret animal studies into a risk assessment or regulatory action. Like I just said on the last slide, short chain compounds, from what we can see, still produce hazard effects, even if they're cleared really rapidly, and that the extent of exposures is the critical factor, and that there, obviously is a very high need for additional data on more compounds that we know are in drinking water and human serum in North Carolina and Minnesota and New Jersey and multiple other states. And so we are working on really as many of them as we can, but there needs to be, I think, more of this directly risk assessment, translatable work being done. And then the very last point, we've published 2 mixture studies. And so all of this needs to also be put into the context of that we know that every single person has multiple PFAS exposures in their serum, and that the data that we've published so far shows very strong data for dose additive effects, where there's a common endpoint, regardless of whether they're carboxylates or sulfonates. And so we really need to be taking into account multiple exposures and mixture-based effects in order to be protective of human health. As an acknowledgement slide, just acknowledge especially Earl and Christy and Nikki, who have done a whole lot of the work that I published here and otherwise. And this is my contact information if you need to reach me for anything after this meeting. Then I'll stop.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Are there questions from anyone on the board or anyone that's in the room, as well as anyone online for Justin? Rich has one.
Great talk, Justin, thanks. So was the enlarged liver, were they fatty livers? Was there evidence of that?
So we didn't have, so that is, I'll caveat it by saying that's one of our largest costs is the histopathological evaluation. So we did not have histopathology done on the maternal enlarged livers. The pup livers, we also you have to do oil red O staining to identify lipid composition, and we did not do that. In some of the other work, oftentimes you'll see some indications of necrosis or fibrosis. That wasn't the case here, at least in the H&E staining, but we didn't do oil red O. So I can't say if it was lipids specifically or cellular just hyperplasia, but yeah.
Delef.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Justin. Very nice. I'm curious, with the match that you found with PFMOA serum levels and PFOA serum levels, but then lower GenX serum levels, do you think there's like higher bioaccumulation of ultra short chain PFAS compared to maybe the intermediate chain length, maybe 5, 6?
So it's a great question. I've kind of continued to be a little bit stumped, and just for clarity, I've repeated the GenX studies to make sure that those lower serum levels were repeatable. And we've done the same protocol twice actually, and the data is exactly the same. So I know that those maternal PND2 serum levels, those are taken, I should also say, those are taken 2 hours, there's all different study protocols, right? So we do 2 hours approximately after the final oral dose, which in the female rat, for a lot of these compounds, you're in the ballpark of the Cmax. You're in the ballpark of the maximum serum concentration. And then they all tend to, especially most of what we're looking at with the carboxylates, they get excreted pretty rapidly. And so it's kind of start to decline pretty quickly after that. And so I can only assume, for whatever reason, that Gen X has a lower absorption rate, potentially from the gut into the serum, combined with also a very rapid elimination rate. And that I assumed initially that the PFMOA serum levels would probably be the same as the Gen X levels, and they were quite a bit higher. I'm confident in those numbers. But it would seem to me that PFMOA is very well absorbed and also quickly eliminated, but that Cmax you hit initially, like pretty soon after an oral exposure in an animal study, is really quite high. And so interpreting that in terms of a pharmacokinetic model, I think, is important to understand repeated dosing and what that means in terms of like human drinking water exposures. And that's beyond what we do, but at least it gives some context as to differences between those compounds. But at least in the rat, they don't bioaccumulate in the liver. I mean, typically the liver concentrations are about the same as the serum, or they're lower, right? Often with these anyway. That's not the case with some of the sulfonates. They can be quite a bit higher in the liver.
And I was asking also because recently I've come across some papers where maybe in communities that are not very highly exposed, trifluoroacetic acid can be the dominant PFAS in blood serum. And so I'm really very curious about the behavior of ultra short chains. Yeah.
The TFA's been on our radar. It's a little bit difficult to work with in the lab. It's very volatile in its pure form, so there's some risk from just a laboratory perspective. There is an ECHA registration dossier for TFA, so there is industry data that can be had, but there's very little or anything in the literature about TFA. Yeah.
What was the source of the test material and its chemical conformation? I was asking because in one of the 2 papers we had to review back in 2022, there was a section in the methods that said they had to synthesize it to be able to confirm it in serum samples. And I was like,
So, kind of what, like sort of just a general ballpark how things work oftentimes is I'll just walk over to the building where Mark Striner and James McCord are and be like, it's like, tell me what's new, and they're like, oh, this thing. And I'm like, okay, can I buy it? And oftentimes they're like, no, you can't buy it. And then, so PFMOA came up as like this is in really high levels and nobody was making it and we're not going to synthesize it, nobody in my group anyway. And so, 2 years ago, Mark called me and was like, hey, Florix, a chemical supplier, an analytical supplier is manufacturing it now and you can buy it. It is very expensive from a laboratory perspective. So that also plays into like how long we do our exposures and whatnot. But no, that is a pure compound sourced from a reputable supplier of analytical standards. And then, James and I think Jackie Bangma did all of the analytical work on this study for us.
Yeah. So back in 2022, the board, didn't say that there wasn't enough toxicological data. They just said that there wasn't any with which really to derive a reference dose because there wasn't in a mammalian system a bracketed no effect, an adverse effect associated with PFAS. But now in a mammalian system dosed at a sensitive time or appropriately sensitive time period by a route of exposure that's environmentally relevant, you would have a variety of endpoints that are bracketed from no effects to effects with which to derive a reference dose, complemented by all the paired serum and liver chemistries to be able to start to get at some of the metabolism information for which people would just use safety factors otherwise. So it seems like the answer, if the board was to review this now, would be different in terms of, is there an adequate information base with which to derive a reference dose? There'd be a lot to think about there, though, with regard to that clearance rate and how does the compound occurring and what's the trend for the compound now about whether or not, that's a needed regulatory tool in the toolbox to complement all the others. But I just wanted to offer that from what I've heard, relative to what our charge was previously, we probably would have come up with a different answer had we had this, simply because we weren't saying that we need more information. It was that we don't have a bracketed mammalian effect at the time.
So, I mean, that's one of our, main objectives in our study designs is to put data into the peer-reviewed literature that can be directly and I think fairly straightforwardly used in a risk assessment or regulatory process for deriving a reference dose and an exposure level.
So maybe following up on that, the lowest dose that you tested actually had an adverse effect. Are you planning to test lower doses?
Not at the moment in terms of like studying PFMOA by itself at specifically lower doses. We have since then done a mixture study that includes PFMOA at considerably lower levels than were in this individual study. So we have used it at lower doses, but not in an isolated exposure scenario. And my understanding is that it is, even from a, risk assessment has advanced, I think, my knowledge beyond the more common use of low L's and no L's to benchmark dose response and benchmark dose modeling and a focus on the dose response curve versus specifically individual effect levels. But my understanding is also that even the benchmark dose modeling software prefers or works somewhat better if there is a no effect or a very close to control effect level. And for some of these, like the thyroid hormones, you're already at a pretty significant drop even at the lowest dose. So, if I had to do it all over again, I probably would have shifted it down, but it is what it is. Yeah.
Any other questions from the folks in the room or from Gina or Elena online? Well, again, thank you so much for your time and the work behind it and for being here in person. It's good to see you.
Thanks. You as well.
We appreciate it. We do have another update on the same compound, PFMOAA. This one comes from our own Jamie DeWitt, who, when she joined our board, was with East Carolina University's Brody School of Medicine. But as you know, last year was selected as the director of the Environmental Health Sciences program at Oregon State. And our move to quarterly meetings instead of every other month has made it possible for Jamie to schedule to be here in person for our meetings, which we appreciate. Jamie was a co-author of one of the two studies that we looked at back in 2022, for which we also referenced that there was going to be a follow-up study that included higher doses, which we thought, might get at the issue that was a limitation last time, that there wasn't an effect at the highest dose given that was associated with typical PFAS endpoints.
PowerPoint's giving me a hard time.
It's because they're outside of North Carolina.
Yeah. I don't like it.
Dylan's on the way. It'll be solved shortly.
PowerPoint just crashed.
Yeah,
Well, I can-
opened it, and I opened it in safety mode.
While they're getting the slides up, I can say a couple of things. I think one of the promises that I made almost 2 years ago is that these data would be fairly close to being submitted for publication. But we are wrangling with some of the data that we have for our serum and urine levels. We have had these evaluated by two separate groups, and the data are very different. So we're trying to see if we can get a third group to analyze our serum and urine data. And what we have found is very similar to what Justin just reported, in that there is relatively high levels in the serum as well as relatively high levels in the urine. And there is a striking sex difference in terms of serum concentrations for PFMOAA and urine concentrations. And my studies are in adult animals. These are not developmental studies. But one of our analytical labs reported that there's no detectable PFMOAA in the urine or the serum. And then we had the higher concentrations from some of our academic partners who did the analyses for us. And they were just doing the analyses initially to come up with methods for PFMOAA that they could use for detection of this PFAS in some developmental studies that we had done. So when we had the results that were very different from the lab that we had used before, we wanted to have those data reanalyzed so that we would be confident that what our academic partners gave us was what was really present in the animals. But just real briefly, I can tell you all that these studies were conducted with funding from the PFAS Testing Network, as well as with some funding from the Superfund Research Program. What I'll be presenting here today are the studies that were funded with the PFAS Testing Network. When we do our studies for the Superfund, we look a little bit more into the B cell side of the immune system equation. I will go over just briefly our impetus for doing these studies. We focus on the immune system, and we focus specifically on what is known as the T cell dependent antibody response as our endpoint of importance for the immune system. This is a response that's analogous to the vaccine response when people get vaccinated. So the same types of processes and cells are involved in rodents as are in humans. The reason that we're doing these immunotoxicity studies is that, well, A, I'm an immunotoxicologist, but B, we've seen. Great. Oh, no problem. All right. So again, I'm Jamie from Oregon State, and I already gave you a little bit of background. I've already shared some of my declarations, but I wanted to go over real quickly the impetus for our studies. As I mentioned, this is what we're looking at are analogs to the vaccine response in people. And we know that when people are exposed to PFOA and PFOS, there are decreases in their immune system's ability to make antibodies to a vaccine. This has been identified as a critical effect for PFOA in the non-cancer reference dose for the MCLs, and it at one time was identified as a critical effect for PFOS, but it was one order of magnitude lower than liver effects and cardiovascular effects and developmental effects for PFOS in the non-cancer assessment. What I want to share here is a review that came out in 2023. This is a review that looked at the epidemiological data for these particular endpoints. So looking at all of the different studies that had measured vaccine antibody responses, and I'm showing data here just for PFOA and PFOS. One of the criticisms that has been raised about the antibody data is that there's not consistency in the response, so the associations are all over the place. But this particular systematic review looked at the data and found that there was actually homogeneity of associations across the different antibody types. So in other words, if there was suppression of one particular antibody, then there was suppression of other particular antibodies. So differences among antibodies are kind of irrelevant. There are consistent decreases in antibodies produced for different vaccines. And this systematic review also determined that children appear more sensitive than adults. So maybe I should get some samples from Justin and look at whether we can immunize some of your animals and look at some antibody responses. But this review came out in 2023, and the reference is up at the top. But again, we look at the T-cell dependent antibody response. We also look at liver peroxisome activity just as a marker of relative potency. Our studies are all conducted in adult C57 Black 6 animals. We do exposures for 30 days. We loosely follow a guideline study for immunotoxicity testing, but we also do daily observations. We collect body weight, we collect organ weights at the end of the study, and when we're doing our antibody responses, we also look at cells in the primary and secondary lymphoid organs, so the thymus and the spleen. And we also do some flow cytometric work on the spleen and the thymus, which I won't show here today. So we also often include a positive control of PFOA at 7.5 milligrams per kilogram. That is a dose that suppresses the T-cell dependent antibody response, and that is associated with about 150% increase in the weight of the liver as well as peroxisome proliferation. I don't think I have those positive control data to show you for PFMOAA, but we have previously published them. So after the end of the 30-day exposure period, we terminate the animals. So when we do collect our blood, it is at 24 hours after the last oral exposure. When we collect urine, it's after day 1, after day 5, and after day 15 of exposure. We do our immunizations 5 days before the end of the exposure period. So when we collect our blood at the 6th day after the immunizations, that's the peak of IgM antibody production, and that's going to be specific to the antigen that we vaccinate animals with. And in a mouse model, we use sheep red blood cells. In terms of PFMOAA, and I should probably indicate what our doses were, we used 0, 0.5, 5, and 50 milligrams per kilogram, and I have those dose ranges on a different slide when I show some of the data. But in terms of what we observed of some of the basic toxicological outcomes, we didn't see any detectable changes in body weight over the course of the exposure period. We did see an increase in liver weights in both male and female animals in the highest dose group, that's 50 milligrams per kilogram. The male animals appeared to be more sensitive with about 150% increase in their liver weights and only about a 44% increase in females. We didn't see any changes in the size of the spleen or the size of the thymus, nor did we see any changes in the numbers of cells in the spleen or thymus, nor did we see any robust changes in any of the specific immune cell subtypes that we tend to look at in the spleen and the thymus. So in terms of these very general toxicological effects, we didn't see anything of note in these adult mice after 30 days of exposure at the doses that we administered. In terms of liver peroxisomal enzyme activity, we did see an increase in male animals at the highest dose administered, and that was about a 260% increase. Again, this is a marker of a particular enzyme that's in the peroxisome proliferator activated receptor alpha family. So we give the animals an enzyme or a substrate, and then we look at how much of that substrate is used by the enzyme. And this is typically used as a marker of exposure in animals so that we can assess relative potency. 7.5 milligrams per kilogram of PFOA is going to increase this response to the degree of that 50 mg per kg group in about that range. You can see we didn't see anything in the females in terms of elevations in this particular endpoint. In terms of the T-cell dependent antibody response, oh, my arrows disappeared. Sorry. We did see a decrease in the T-cell dependent antibody response at 50 mg per kg in males, about a 55% decrease, which is quite a large increase, although with 7.5 mg per kg of PFOA, we'll see increases in the 70 to 90%. We did see an increase in the low dose group of the females. We don't really know what it means when IgM antibody increases like that. We don't know if it's adverse. We just know that it was a statistically significant difference. Over time, it could mean that there could be differences in how the immune cells switch from an IgM antibody to an IgG antibody. It may indicate that there could be some shifts in subtypes of B or T cells. We didn't see any when we looked at the different subtypes. But what we see here is that there is suppression in males at this highest dose administered. And the serum concentrations, and again, these are not hard and fast serum concentrations, but serum concentrations in the male animals 1 day after dosing ended was about 75,000 nanograms per mil. So fairly high concentrations. That's about as high as what we would see if we give 3.75 mg per kg of PFOA to rodents for 30 days. So kind of interesting, but also very high concentrations in the urine. Oh, there are my arrows. And that's really all that I have to present. This work was mostly conducted by Emma Tobin, who is a master's student in the lab, who's now a doctoral student at NC State. And I already mentioned that it was funded by the PFAS Testing Network.
Thank you, Jamie. Questions for Jamie from folks in the room or people online?
We hope to have these data submitted for publication soon, once we get the serum and urine concentrations figured out.
That's the way science works. Slow and steady. All right. Well, thanks so much. And again, I think, as a general revisitation, even when we had data to derive a reference dose for Gen X, the board had made a recommendation to revisit that, within 3 years because of the pace with which effects data are being generated for this class of compounds. And when we made the finding for the PFMOAA in late 2022 or early 2023, it was, well, we need to take a look at that again soon. Although there wasn't adequate information for a reference dose, it wouldn't have surprised us if there was going to be. Again, whether or not there's the need for a reference dose in terms of another tool in the regulatory toolbox with all the things that we heard about this morning that are working in terms of drinking water standards, groundwater standards, surface water standards, perhaps it's just something to consider, but it does seem like that there may be that adequate information base now for a reference dose. Assistant Secretary Mason.
Well, since you teed it up, I'm going to, sort of bring back that original request that we made, which is looking at the available science. What can this board provide to the agency related to PFMOAA in terms of either a reference dose, a screening level, or some threshold that perhaps could be used as an advisory level. I think it would be, if you all are still interested and willing to revisit with Justin's work, that same request that we made a while back, and add this study as part of that compendium. And how would we go about developing that outcome, that product? And I would say the reason for that, in my mind, is PFMOA is a North Carolina specific signature compound that we deal with on a daily basis. We have many residents in the Southeast North Carolina that are that have levels over 10 parts per trillion. And as a result, those homeowners are given, options under the consent order with filtration options, connection. So it would be really, I think, useful, along with what we talked about 2 years ago, which is that level reasonable? And does the science show that an alternative level needs to be looked at? And so that is the reality. And I think this board can help us bring some scientific backing to those numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it could be revisited as simply as what the original charge was back in 2022, which was to review the studies that were available and to advise on whether the studies provide sufficient scientific information to determine a point of departure to derive a reference dose. That's what it was at the time. We could also work with you and Franny and other folks and state staff to see if there's any modification of that charge with regard to considering the rapid metabolism, the existing regulatory tools that are in progress now, the co-occurrence of that compound with others, about whether or not you wanted to modify the charge any to add those things to it. All right, I'll suggest that then as a path forward. We've got another study pending. We'll look at Justin's and we'll, at a minimum, keep the previous charge, but we'll see if there's any additional charge before we route it back out to the members that aren't here for comments. Great. Well, we are within the last couple of presentations of the day, and we're going to pivot away from a morning focus on PFAS before we revisit again at the end. We're going to be joined again by Dr. Virginia Guidry with the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology section to talk to us about an update of the National Toxicology Program's pending report on fluoride.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. This will probably be fairly brief, but we wanted to give you all an update and share what we're seeing as the path forward on this issue where we have a legislative request, which you may be aware of, but let me just go ahead and jump in. Okay, so just quick background. As you all know, fluoride is a mineral that's been shown to be very effective in preventing and reversing dental decay by strengthening tooth enamel. And we have been adding fluoride to drinking water in North Carolina since 1949. And since that practice has started, we have seen that there are reductions in tooth decay rates associated with the optimally fluoridated water. For a little bit of a reference, in 2014, DHHS recommended that here in our state, we use the lower end of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recommended range for fluoride in drinking water. So we recommended 0.7 milligrams per liter to be used. And in part, that was lowered because now we have many sources of topical fluoride that are also helping with dental enamel and tooth health. Fluoridation has been studied for about 70 years. There's a large body of evidence showing its effectiveness for oral health. And you may be aware that the National Toxicology Program, or NTP, has been conducting a systematic review of the scientific research on fluoride exposure and possible neurodevelopmental and cognitive health effects in humans. So looking at the neurological, basically, potential effects separately from the oral health impacts. And so in 2023, there was a law passed that actually asked the Commission for Public Health to perform a review of the NTP's draft report, the monograph on the state of science concerning fluoride exposure and neurodevelopment and cognitive health effects, a systematic review, as well as the studies reviewed in the report and other studies that the Commission finds relevant. So that was asked of the Commission for Public Health in 2023. And associated with that, the request was for the Commission to make a report to the General Assembly on or before February 1st, 2024, of its findings and recommendations, and include those recommendations in that report. And so basically what the Commission for Public Health, or what NCDHHS did on behalf of the Commission for Public Health, is send a response to the General Assembly that pointed out that the 2022 NTP report remains under review and revision. I'm going to give a little bit more of an update on that shortly. And so we think that consideration of the report for changes in North Carolina is premature. Basically, we want to wait until the NTP report gets finalized. And additionally, DHHS stated that the Commission for Public Health is not best situated to evaluate the report, and referenced that review to the Secretary's Scientific Advisory Board, and noted that this is comprised of experts better suited to this type of review. And so, continuing our story here, in 2024, there was a law passed that basically asked for the exact same things, but asked for the Secretary's Science Advisory Board to do that review and to provide recommendations instead of the Commission for Public Health. So here's a screenshot of that. And then, the second part of that there on the recommendations. And so just for a quick update on the status of the NTP report, which is really at the heart of all of this, here's a snapshot of the webpage where updates are provided on the status of the report. And basically, NTP conducted the systematic review of the research on fluoride exposure and neurodevelopment and cognitive health effects. It underwent 2 peer reviews by National Academies of Science, and both times the committee stated that NTP had not adequately supported its conclusions that fluoride should be classified as a neurodevelopmental hazard. So then based on that review, NTP removed the hazard classification of fluoride and made additional changes, resulting in 2 draft documents: an NTP monograph on the state of the science that is summarizing the research through May 2020, and then a manuscript on the meta-analysis of the data that were in those research findings published through 2021. And so because of this back and forth, this is why we are seeing it as premature to review the literature when that is actively happening right now. And we are waiting to hear what the final NTP analysis will be. And so the Board of Scientific Counselors at NTP recommended 93 revisions to that monograph and 81 revisions to the meta-analysis manuscript. This is all documented on their webpage, so you can follow along with it. The Board of Scientific Counselors accepted the working group's recommendations to revise those 2 documents and sent their final report to the NIEHS and NTP director in May 2023. And as of this month, a few days ago, the publication of that monograph and the meta-analysis are still pending. So my understanding from talking to some folks at NIEHS and NTP is that it is in progress and will likely come out soon, but it has not come out yet, at least as of my last check on August 5th. So we're still waiting to see those final documents. And so our recommendation at NCEDHHS is to wait for the final NTP report to complete any assessment of the health risks of fluoride in drinking water. We're right on the verge of getting those documents as far as we understand. Our plan is to review the materials when they become available and determine what specific asks or a charge might be for the SAB based on that review. And I didn't point this out when I was showing screenshots of the legislation earlier, but the legislation was asking for the SAB to do that review by December 1st, 2024. And so just noting here that it's highly unlikely that the review, the formulation of a charge, and any subsequent work will be completed by December 1st of this year as we continue to wait for that report. So based on that, we will begin formulating a response to the General Assembly, just kind of pointing out this timeline and the challenges here. And our plan is to generate that response and then share it with the SAB for review as sort of an interim response to this request. Yep, and that's it. So let me pause there and see, Tom or Betsy, have anything you want to add to that, or if there's any questions from the board about this. We just wanted to give you all an update on it.
Betsy, I'll let you go first. I have a couple of observations, but go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think Virginia did a great job kind of walking through. I wasn't sure if, well, like we weren't sure if members of the SAB understood that SAB was included in this legislative request. SAB really serves to inform or to advise the departments. So we'll have to think, that's why we're thinking through the department, make a recommendation in consultation with the SAB. So we can certainly get to the spirit of the legislation and think through that. I think it likely the same way the Commission for Public Health said it was premature to really evaluate this as these documents were pending, and really thinking through, as we've done with other issues, when there's federal evaluation going on, we don't want to do duplication of effort, and best to wait until then. And I think probably neither body is great in terms of this. The Commission but with Secretaries Advisory Board having at least some more toxicology expertise, felt a little bit of a better body than the Commission for Public Health, which really doesn't have any toxicology expertise. So even though this board isn't necessarily the perfect fit, it's closer than the Commission for Public Health, which is one of our recommendations. So I think that's probably about it. And Tom, I'd love to hear that. And then questions that you all have, we welcome.
No, I don't have anything else to add. I think you covered what my perspective was, which if the review that's in progress seems robust and timely. The expertise that the state agencies have is valuable, and having them take a first crack at it and then focusing any questions to the Science Advisory Board where it could be value added makes sense to me. So any questions from board members or comments since your board is mentioned in that state law?
So is there any idea when these reports will finally be finalized? Not really.
I was originally informally told maybe August 1st. They haven't come out yet, but so I think they're pretty close. But I think there's just a lot of pieces at play there.
And also, just something that people probably know, but worth saying is unlike, something like PFMOA or when we had Gen X, it's not going to be a couple of studies to review. Something like the epidemiology and toxicology of fluoride would be a massive amount of effort. And so piggybacking onto somebody else's review, letting the state look at it for the context of how they use science and management, and then focusing any recommendations where the board could be of assistance makes good sense. All right. Any last comments? We move along.
I'm just curious. I don't know whether you've seen any of the materials in draft form. Is there going to be a recommendation on whether or not to continue fluoridation of water?
So my understanding from conversations, so the drafts are on the NTP webpage that I referenced, but not the final versions. And my understanding is that those documents will not go to that extent. It will be a review of the literature, for the neurodevelopmental and neurotoxic effects, but not to the point of public health practice and what levels should be used in drinking water. That's my understanding.
Any last comments? Thanks very much, Virginia. That brings us to our last item for today, where we'll head back toward PFAS work. Franny is going to give us an update on the consent order studies. We've been becoming apprised of those from the time that they were negotiated to study protocols in development, and now are hearing about even results as they roll in. And then after that, we'll see if there's anybody who had signed up for the public forum, and that would close us out for the day.
All right. I didn't change the date on this title slide. My apologies. This is for today. I didn't notice that until now. I'm going to give a quick update on the status of these toxicology studies that are ordered through the Camorra's consent order. I'm going to give status updates of both the aquatic toxicology studies and the rodent toxicology studies. And then I planned on doing some summaries of the results, and I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you there, but I'll explain that when I get to it. So just as a refresher, the Camorra's consent order, paragraph 14, is the one that dictates the toxicological studies of these 5 consent order PFAS. These are not the comprehensive list that is known as attachment C. This is attachment B that is relative to the toxicology studies. All 5 of these compounds are going to be examined in all of the different animal models. These animal models are rats and mice, and in the rodent studies, they are going to do the 90-day classic toxicological national toxicology program protocols, and then there's also going to be a 28-day oral immunotoxicology study in each rats and mice. Those are the mammalian studies, and those are more related to human health. The aquatic toxicology studies are completed in some cases and close to completion in others, but these are the studies for ecological impacts, and these are the studies that are designed to generate a lab-derived bioconcentration factor, which is used in place of the bioaccumulation factors when you don't have real-world data to use in our standards development. So these are algae studies, Daphnia studies, both acute and chronic. So those are 48 hours and 96-hour studies, a 96-hour fish toxicology study, and then a sediment study, which is a 10-day invert study, and that's with earthworm. I'll start with the aquatic toxicology studies. We've been through a lot of discourse with Comores about these studies, and finally in April and December of 2022, we had all of the protocols approved for all 5 of these studies for all 5 compounds, so 25 protocols in total. They did the range finding tests for these 5 different models and 5 different compounds for each of them in January to July of last year, and we did the dose approval for the definitive tests in also the summer of last year. While some of that was going on, we had some of the dose approvals were happening earlier, and so some of the definitive tests started in April last year, but they've carried through through November of last year. We have the final reports for 3 of these 5 animal models, and so we have all 5 compounds for the algae studies, the acute Daphnia study, and the fish studies. We received the algae data in January this year, and then the Daphnia and fish data were received in just July, so last month. The remaining aquatic tox studies are the chronic Daphnia study, so the 96-hour Daphnia exposure, and then also the 10-day earthworms and sediment study. Those are underway. The chronic Daphnia study, I believe, is doing the in-life experiment either now or it's on the docket in the lab to start soon. And then we have only recently gotten the sediment study together, and I'll talk about that in a second. There are a few different steps here when we're talking about approval. So first is this final protocol approval for each of them. And these are just the dates and months these happen, just for your awareness. It's kind of a complicated table. After they do the range finding studies where they determine the appropriate range not to cause overt toxicity, but to see toxic effects, they also provide analytical validation for the concentrations that are being dosed. And so we have all of that information as well. Once all of that happens, we have meetings with Comores, the toxicologist, and the contract lab to discuss the final doses, and DEQ gets approval on the doses that are selected for the definitive test, and then they conduct the definitive test. And so the second to last column here, I don't know if you can see is the definitive test conducted. And you can see if you just look across the table that almost all of them have either been done or are soon to be done. The last ecotox study or animal model that we had going through this approval process was the earthworms in sediment study. And this was because we asked them to do some additional validation during the range finding process. And this is because we wanted to make sure that any water changes that were happening were still the appropriate doses. And so these were a couple additional validation steps than would normally be done, either with the OECD guidelines or any of the other guidelines that they use to develop the protocols. But we just asked for this so we can be explicitly sure the experiments are happening the way they are intended. And so they were amenable to all of that. And so we had the range finding reports I received also in July, and we are planning to have a meeting for the dose approval and definitive test for this in August. And I think that might just be a quick meeting between DEQ Comores and then the contract lab, but that should happen pretty quickly now that we have all the range finding data. When the test will be scheduled, it'll be based on the lab availability, but that's the last ecotox study that is to be done for the consent order for all 5 compounds. The rodent studies have a bit of a different process. The way that this works with this contract lab is that they do all the range finding test and the analytical validation prior to any dose approval. And then the dose is approved and then incorporated into the final protocol. And then that's when the protocol is approved and when the tests are done. And so they just have a different process. These protocols are also more complicated than the ecotox protocols because they're mammalian studies and there are a lot of other husbandry requirements and lab animal care and use guidelines. As far as these are concerned, I have the steps of the approval process in that first column, and then all 5 of the compounds across the top here instead of the different models. And the way we're doing this is by compound first, because the compound doses have to be approved before they're incorporated into the protocol, and the protocol is then finalized. Naphthalene byproduct 2 was the first one that went through this process. We had, the range finding reports, we had meetings at the end of last year. The protocol was approved right at the end of last year, and then they got everything scheduled with the lab. The definitive tests started in, I believe, mid-June, and it was the 28-day immunotox studies that happened first, and so those progressed through about July 4th weekend. So the in-life portion of that study has ended. Right now, they're doing all of the analysis of tissues and things like that. I'm kind of expecting the final reports for naphthalene byproduct 2 immunotox results in the fall of this year. It'll take a couple months for the lab to finish their analysis and create this very long report. And then that gets submitted to Chemours. And then Chemours approves that from the lab, and then we get it after Chemours approves it. So it's an additional step that we wouldn't normally have with a third-party lab, but because of the consent order, there's more of a review process than it would be if we were just paying a lab to do this for us. The other 4 compounds are all going to be approved at the same time. And so I received all of the range finding data for these compounds at the end of last year in October. The toxicologist from Chemours sent me their proposed doses for the definitive tests in the spring. And we are having a meeting with Chemours and the third-party lab tomorrow morning, actually, to talk about these doses. And so the doses they proposed are appropriate. They are reasonable. And so we're going to have what I'm hoping will be a very productive conversation in getting these compounds moved along in this timeline. The next step would be finalizing these protocols after the doses are approved, and then they get all of these tests scheduled with the lab. The way that this is working is that the 28-day tests are going first, and they're using those doses to determine what is appropriate for the 90-day test. We've had some discourse back and forth about whether they could do these at the same time and what the time frame is, and this is just the way the lab prefers to do this. And based on the timeline of the lab and the people at the lab that are working under the consent order, this is how this is going to happen. That being said, I was planning to share the results of these 3 models for all 5 compounds from these tests. And I can't actually do that because all of the final reports were marked as trade secrets. And so that's confidential business information that I can't present publicly. We are trying to figure out why exactly that happened. I'm hoping to present this information to this board at the end of the year. It's unclear why it was marked this way, and it may have just been an oversight. But we're trying to figure out if there's, information about the compounds and the methods that maybe is perhaps confidential. But yeah, I can't share any of this, so sorry about that. But that's it, short and sweet. That was all.
My sense is that the mammalian toxicity data will be more meaningful for the state's path forward in general, although Rich and me and Jamie, when she got out of school, were all ecotoxicologists, and I'd love to dig into seeing what those compounds do to those creatures. But I think the mammalian path forward is what's going to be the most helpful in terms of moving science into risk management for the state. That'd be my guess anyway.
I agree. And so curious as to why these were marked this way, and I want to resolve that before we get the final reports from the
Yeah, of
road
course.
studies.
I'm sure there's some workaround if you need something from the board, even if that imprinter stays on it. There's people on the board that probably already have that CBI training and could sign a few things if you need that kind of assistance moving forward. Any questions for Franny on the status of the consent order studies, which are moving toward fruition?
I saw Elaine had a question that flashed by.
Super. Elena,
Saw it pass by, but I couldn't read it all the way.
maybe Dylan's got it.
She asked, can you share any details in regards to the mammalian protocols, e.g. Dosing vehicles and dose rates?
I will look at the finalized protocol and make sure it's not confidential, but I think I can share that with you. I'll check and let you know. I do have that information for Nafion byproduct 2, but not the doses for the others yet. We're about to discuss that with Commerce tomorrow.
Yeah, if the methods are consistent across all of them and it's allowed to be shared, maybe that's the best way to respond to Elena's question is what's the method section for the Nafion byproduct 2 one? And that would have, everything but actual doses in it that's going to be set tomorrow, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'll check.
Thank you for the question online, Elena. Anyone else? Bella,
Maybe just
sure.
A little curious, are the endpoints that are being looked at informed by things we already know? Or, like when I saw classic tox, it made me kind of wonder, are we potentially looking at things that may not necessarily be the most sensitive endpoints? Just
Meaning
curious.
that, does it include thyroid? Does it include liver? Does it include immunology that seem to be responsive to these compounds? I got you.
Yeah, perhaps classic toxicology studies was not the appropriate phrase to use for that because it's the standard 90-day National Toxicology Program protocol that they're following. So it's not just lethal dose 50 that they're after. And I don't remember offhand what all of the endpoints were for the 90-day study, but I can look and get back to you on that. For the immunotox studies, I know we have the TDAR assay and a few others that are very similar to what Jamie presented because they based a lot of that protocol design off of the same protocols her work is designed off from. So yeah, I can follow up with the endpoints for the 90-day studies. I don't remember offhand.
Sure. Yeah, and it sounds like, again, if the Nafion byproduct 2 one is nearing some point where it's available and on embargo, that might satisfy everybody's questions in that regard in terms of study design and study dosing approach and measurement endpoints. Anything else from anybody in the room or online? Thank you, Franny, for that update. Did we have anybody sign up for the public forum section since I asked this morning?
Well, let me check. There wasn't during the lunch break.
Dylan says no from online. Then I will close this out by thanking Franny again for working with the departments that we serve to craft today's agenda, to Dylan for the IT support throughout the meeting, and to Paula for arranging lunch as well as parking passes and making the logistics easy. I'll remind the board members that our next meeting is a winter meeting, December 4th, right here. Winter might seem like a long ways away, but I picked this up on the way in. There's a little bit of color in this leaf. So although it's hot and muggy out now, it's coming. There's hope. There's hope for those of you that like fall and winter. I guess I should say fall, meaning December 4th, still fall. All right. With that, it would be appropriate for a motion to close this out. Rich, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Well, thanks again, everybody. I'll reiterate the thanks that Sushma Masemore provided. We know it's an obligation on all your time. But the science applied to rulemaking is important for us to understand the path of the rulemakings moving forward. So thanks so much for being attentive to the presentations today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.